It is indeed showtime. I am live, but I'm not alone. Welcome to another Atypical Philosopher video. This evening, I will be discussing God with a fellow YouTuber who goes by the name of Canadian Catholic, and you might have seen him around sort of talking with a few other YouTubers as well, and internet names and scholars and whatnot. So I think he recently had a bit of a discussion on whether Jesus existed with Richard Carrier. So anyway, we are going to talk about God and atheism, theism and atheism, but it's not going to be a formal debate. It's going to be hopefully a discussion where we can just, pick apart each other's ideas and claims in a kind of, convivial way. That's the theory anyway. But so here is Canadian Catholic or Joshua. I don't know how you would like to be called.
So
but,
yeah, anyway, for Joshua, Josh is fine. That's my name.
Cool.
So I'm used to both, either Josh or Joshua is okay. And Canadian Catholic is my username. So yeah, I have a great channel. I think your channel is wonderful too. I have a great channel. I host wonderful scholars, some of the greatest names, people like Noam Chomsky, Lawrence Krauss, Richard Swinburne, Bart Ehrman, as Mr. Pearce mentioned, Richard Carrier, Robert Price. It just goes on. Wonderful people. So definitely want to keep abreast of things.
So here it is, Canadian Catholic. So there's Bart Ehrman, and just trying to work out Simon Blackburn. He's great, philosopher. Michael Behe, slightly less my kind of.
Okay, we give everyone. So yeah.
But no. Obviously, it depends what floats your boat. But there's his YouTube channel. Check it out. Everything's being a bit.
I actually had a discussion with somebody whose book you published. You can see there with Gunther Layard, I believe. He was had a very high praise to offer for you.
Oh, that's good.
We had Gary Habermas for the second time on, and that's just recent. I mean, you can see a lot of other things there. I mean,
there's a lot of good stuff. I'm sure. So that's fantastic. And is that Arif Ahmed? I like him.
Yes, Arif Ahmed, wonderful man.
Yeah, so that's good stuff. So check.
So you froze on my side, Mr. Pearce.
It's a bit early doors at the moment. So tonight we'll discuss. As I try and click the right button here, it's behaving very well. We'll be discussing whether or not God exists. And I suppose before we delve into the details and to get into the long grass of philosophy and theology, do you want to just introduce yourself, who you are, how you got to what you believe?
Yeah, so I'll actually start with how I discovered you in a bit of a correction. So I'm not just here to discuss whether God exists or not, just a little bit on Christianity as well. Obviously, not whether Christianity should be to touch on that, because I think your recent work has been specific on Christianity and my disagreement. So the way I found you is you kind of lingered in my mind for a bit. So I hear all these names all around, the world. So right now I'm a student actually at the University of Toronto. I do philosophy. I major in philosophy. And so, like, I hear a lot of names because I'm interested in internet stuff. Like, I grew up pretty sheltered. I've said that before. Homeschooled, so on and so forth. Non-denominational Christian. So I became an atheist at around 17, somewhere there. And now I'm a Roman Catholic. So now the point is, how I discovered you is that I hear all of these names, and some of them just linger in the back of my head without ever, going. I just keep hearing this guy, Jonathan MSP or something. I don't know. Then I went on Derek's channel, I believe, and I talked something about Bayesianism a little bit, and somebody, he displayed your book and said, "Oh, well, Jonathan M.S. Pearce, this is a new book. He uses something like that." And I'm like, "Okay, well, again, another name." And then I saw on some anti-Catholic website something of yours being displayed. And so I was like, well, if something is anti-Catholic, sometimes it catches my attention. And I was like, oh, this guy's British. So, if somebody is British, I excuse their anti-Catholicism, because I think that, so it's like, if you're British, that's like, okay, you can excuse that. You can, it's like, being I don't know, French atheist, right? You forgive the French for being atheists, right? So, in Britain, opposition to the Catholic Church is so frequent that, it doesn't surprise me. So that's how I went, and it just snowballed from there. And I kept seeing and seeing all of it, like, when I just paid attention to Randall Rouser, Richard Carrier, all of those people referring to you. And I'm like, okay, who is this guy? So I better talk to him. And it took a while because you have a busy schedule.
Yeah, but it's just been insane because this whole new platform of Only Sky started up, and it's all just been and my YouTube channel. So,
So you've left your own blog, as I understand.
Sorry.
So you've left your own blog, right?
Yeah. So I used to blog for Patheos Non-Religious, but we got cancelled by Patheos. Really, they didn't want people shouting about atheism too much and criticizing religion. They didn't want people being too political, so they effectively got rid of all the non-religious writers, and then some of us were asked to come and join this new venture, Only Sky, which is fantastic. Really, really.
I discovered that from a guy called Hemad Mehta, I believe.
Yeah. So he's friendly atheist. Yeah. So I find it interesting. So you said you were an atheist at 17, and I find that kind of problematic because I've just written a bit on my own, and in fact I've just done a podcast for Only Sky, so an audio. On my own kind of upbringing and why I am like I am, which is quite different to my parents. And I talked about my Christianity at the age of 17, and I just really didn't have a clue on how to be what Christianity meant. I called myself a Christian. You talk about the no true Scotsman fallacy of like, well, what qualifies anyone to be a Christian or an atheist? And I would question, would you, as a 17-year-old, would you truly have been a very thoughtful atheist or a very knowledgeable atheist?
So I would have been close to what new atheists are, I guess. So would I have been an atheist to the satisfaction of philosophical atheist? Probably not. But I would have been an atheist who could make a lot of arguments. So I used to argue. I wasn't an atheist just, okay, there is no God and let's just go and, have fun and just forget it. I was very argumentative. So it was a huge concern, and I used to read a lot. I used to, kind of. I used to encounter a lot of things. Let's put it that way. And I do think that I had some of the ideas. Right.
Yeah, and so for me, I think it's taken me this long to properly understand Christianity, and there are certain elements of Christianity which I think are just not understandable, that I don't think makes sense. So, for example, the atonement and notions like this. So, when I look back to when I was a young person claiming to be a Christian, I just butchered the idea of Christianity and just made up my own kind of religion, really, and then rejected that, and then subsequently became an atheist. But even then, there was more of like, I'd say I'm a proper atheist now. But then there's this idea of who gets to define labels.
No, I relate. I grew up, as I say, sheltered, homeschooled way up to college, very, very sheltered, and not even going to church, just non-denominational type of Bible Christianity. And these concepts of atonement or hardcore Trinitarian, they weren't that much interesting to me. I was the type who was more interested in showing why I guess there were no contradictions in the Bible. So that kind of I guess fundamentalist type. So those were more interesting to me, and history rather than just theology. That was very so I couldn't tell you theories of atonement back then.
Yeah. So we might come onto that as an argument concerning God, but so what took you then from Christian to Catholic, or what is it about Catholicism that's more right than any other denomination?
So I actually went to agnostic and atheist rather than going to Catholicism from some non-denominational form. I didn't go to Catholicism. I went to I guess I let it cool off for a little bit, right? I let the thing cool off for a little bit. So my angry atheist phase passed away to the point that I wasn't angry. I wasn't oh my gosh, religious people are this and that. I wasn't like that anymore. I was it's an interesting topic, and let's enjoy Christmas and stuff like that. I just kind of started to see flaws in these village atheists. So
Well, so this is obviously fighting talk now. So, what flaws in these village atheists would you say there are?
Okay, so one of the bigger ones was kind of so one of the bigger ones I remember is logging into Reddit and going to subreddit atheism. And I used to kind of relate to the subreddit, so I used to pick fights because this seemed like sane people there. And one day I remember it hit me when I saw that Billy Graham had passed away and the top host celebrated his death. I remember that very well in 2018, and that was my one shock that I couldn't anymore say that we are rational at that point. From that's
But,
how it.
yeah, but I mean, you're going to get that in any walk of life.
Yeah, of course.
If Hillary Clinton died, the GOP Republicans would go nuts, and if Trump died, Democrats would go nuts. So but yeah, carry on.
Yeah. So my point was that I understood that it wasn't like atheists are rational and Christians are not anymore. It was like from now on, rationality is probably independent of whether you're an atheist, because you can be a stupid atheist and a smart Christian now, right? And
or vice versa. Yeah.
Or vice versa. Yeah, of course. So it just snowballed from there. I mean, I do remember that very well. I was actually banned from that subreddit. One of like maybe 200 bans from the subreddit I've had over the years. But that was actually very interesting when I remember that. Like you can literally search up again. It was very highly upvoted when I saw that. My tribe was celebrating the death of Billy Graham, right? I mean, I expected them to say something like, "This is a sense, like the man died, we disagreed, but we grieve his death" or something. But it was a celebration. So.
Yeah. And you will get that, and you'll get all.
Yeah, this was an emotional argument. I'm
flavors.
not saying that this is an argument. Like I was an emotional 18-year-old. Like, what do you expect?
Yeah.
So I'm 22, by the way, right now. Some people tell me I look older, and I understand why, but it's not been that much.
So am I. I'm 22. I just had a hard paper round.
Yeah.
Right, yeah. So what would you say now are you think the biggest challenges to atheism, the biggest arguments for theism or against atheism?
So, I mean, if you want to talk about just theism and not like, I would opt for
or whatever, you can talk about what you like.
That's fine. I mean, I'm a Catholic, but that's fine. I mean, I'm fine talking about that. So I would say the biggest challenges are like inductive reasons. So for a long time, I was fascinated with kind of deductive arguments. Like I would give this Aristotelian proof or that proof, and I've come to realize that those aren't the most effective at getting people to understand what we're dealing with. Like, many people get carried away with solving puzzles. I mean, what I want to argue is that there's good reason to think that there's some fundamental part, I guess, or basis to the universe. If the universe began to exist, there's good reason to think there is some part that's necessary or something that caused it. Whatever it is, there is good reason to think that there is this, I guess, uncaused cause, fundamental cause, whatever you want to call it. It doesn't matter. And many atheists would agree with something like this, and that would be fine. And what I'm saying is, well, let's evaluate the evidence. We live in a world with, teleology, inbuilt kind of teleology, I argue.
I just don't know how you could evaluate the evidence, because the problem is, I mean, I've written about this. I've written a book on the Kalam. Did God create the universe from nothing? But the idea that when physics breaks down, it's very hard to get any kind of evidence. There's no predictability. There's literally, you can't use inductive evidence when there is no way of delving into the epoch when science and physics breaks down. So all you can really go to is theoretical physics, which at the moment theoretical physics is pointing in quite a few different directions, but none of them necessitate a god.
Sure. So, like, I didn't say anything about theoretical physics necessitating God. What I'm saying is that with theoretical physics and I guess philosophy, cosmology, so on, we have pretty good reason to think that there is a part of the universe, I guess, or pre-universe that is necessary. It exists of necessity, and you'll find ideas like that in people like Oppie. You'll find ideas like that in many cosmologists who believe that there is a fundamental part. Now, again, this isn't obviously going to be necessarily a God. For a lot of people, this is going to be some part. What I'm saying is. Well, I mean, not all of the universe will be necessary, presumably, but maybe for you.
I don't know how you could split the universe up into any kind of parts. I mean, to me, matter is a brute fact, and it's more simplistic than positing that God plus the universe. So God is necessary and produces contingently the universe. I think it's far more simple and is equally as explanatory in its scope and power to say the universe is a brute fact and is necessary. I don't need to break that up into some part, just
So,
the universe.
yeah, so like I mean, you could probably opt out for necessitarianism if you want, like that everything is necessary. That's obviously not going to be something that many people in quantum physics, for example, will agree with. That's not going to be something that you're going to find because.
But the idea of necessity is problematic. I mean, you talk about this is to do with possible worlds and whether something is necessary, something exists in all possible worlds. But you get that's not a given in philosophy. That is a problematic axiomatic framework to
Sure,
use.
I don't have a problem. Like what I'm saying is that we can't separate between things that are necessary and things that are contingent. Like even if you want to like say, I mean, you'll probably as a determinist agree that not everything is determined, right? I mean, you would have to agree that there's random chance in the world.
No,
So
no.
well, okay, but I mean,
Well, it depends how you interpret quantum, really. And
sure, I mean,
and I'm not gonna say I would favor a deterministic interpretation of quantum, but I don't know because actually no one knows.
no, sure, I understand that. What I'm saying is that there's good reason to think that necessitarianism isn't the case. That's all I'm going to say from my point of view, right? So I'm not going to like challenge you on that if you prefer that that's the case. So I mean, what I'm saying is, if there is a necessary part of the universe, right, or necessary fundamental reality, then we have to evaluate the kind of world it is, right? I mean, we live in that's going to add on evidence, and so I'm going to say, well, the ones that I bring towards the table are, I guess, teleology, ubiquitous religiosity. I actually do use this. So ubiquitous religiosity, I mean, is that the only species that we know is intelligent has religion present ubiquitously. And this is a psychological historical fact, I think. I mean, people can nitpick and say this tribe didn't have it, that tribe didn't have it, but it's pretty fair to say that it's a ubiquitous phenomenon. And then I use something like beauty, for example. And I'll say that, well, we have this evidence together. I'm going to say, well, that surely increases the chance and probability there's a God. And how much, it's obviously going to depend on how much you want. But I mean, I think that there's good reason to conclude based on that there's a God. Now, again, we could delve into like deductive arguments, but I don't think they help. Like, people use those deductive arguments for to solve puzzles sometimes and stuff like that. But they're just going to be something that many people aren't going to find productive.
I would agree with you on deduction. I think deduction is useful, but it only goes so far, and people just move their definitions of God around. And I think I would prefer something like Paul Draper, who takes on the abductive arguments, which is the inference is the best explanation, and it's a cumulative case, and basically every single argument pretty much is abductively
Yes.
preferring atheism. I would argue, but let's just unpick ubiquitous religion, because you're right. Yeah, ubiquitous religiosity, which is the idea that pretty much every community or society.
So this is how I phrase it. The only species that we know that is in principle capable of religiosity that we know of. I'm not saying no one else is. I'm saying we know for sure that humans are. We don't know if there is any species capable of religiosity, such as understanding concepts. Now, people will try to play around and they'll say, well, we see ritual in chimpanzees, and that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about ability to form concepts, ability to worship, ability to have creeds. So, like, chimpanzees having like ritual isn't going to cut it. So I've gotten that bullshit.
Yeah. I'm more interested.
There is only one. So what I'm saying is, from what we know, there is only one species that's capable of conceptualizing so on and so forth. And that one happens to have ubiquitous religiosity, almost omnipresent among it. So what I'm saying is, of course, you can explain it naturalistically. I'm saying, what is it more consistent with?
Well, they
ubiquitously
believe in mythical creatures.
Sure.
Doesn't mean those mythical creatures exist. I mean, I think it's a real problematic logic, because actually, what my opinion would be, what's going on there is ubiquitously every tribe has had a lack of understanding of some phenomena, right? And so that is obviously happening through time, and so therefore something is plugged in to plug that explanatory gap, and also provide other functions. You could talk about the occasional tribe, like the Paraha tribe, who don't believe in God and are pretty much atheistic. But you're right; it's very rare. But I don't think that's a good argument, because I think there are reasons why that would exist, and I think that logic can be applied to other things which you would agree don't exist. It's like.
So I'm not making the argument that because people have God belief that he exists. That wasn't the argument I'm making. I'm making is if there is a theistic God, then we would expect such concepts to have developed in humans, either through perhaps revelation. The other is perhaps through observation of nature that God made. The other is, of course, you can explain this naturalistically and say, well, it was useful in evolution, so on and so forth. All I'm saying is, when taken together, the chance on theism of this happening is almost 100%. If we take theism, not deism, and plausible versions of theism. Whereas on, for example, naturalism or maybe atheism or something, there is a chance of ubiquitous religiosity, but I would say it's maybe 40%, okay, maybe 30%, 50, depends, right? So what I'm saying is, I do think this increases our evidence, and we have to combine it with this necessary existence and the existence of beauty teleology, and I think that gives us the edge. So that's the argument.
I think it's tremendously problematic, because someone like, again, Paul Draper would say, it would like flip that and say that all these things that that we have, all these phenomena, are far more likely on the atheistic hypothesis. And in fact, when I say flip it, what he would say is that if God existed, you would expect most people to believe in the right God. And you would expect religious people to be more moral. This is called the meager moral fruits argument. Right. So as it turns out, that religious people and non-religious people are pretty much morally the same, like give or take. There's no clear difference morally between people. And in fact, social science also shows that people's belief in God depends already on their political and moral positioning, which means that you adapt God to you rather you adapting to God. So that's all the very interesting. There's plenty of data to support that. Now, all of this stuff suggests that the reality is atheistic, because you know, if you're saying that the thesis is that God exists and people believing in God is what you'd expect if God exists, right, then you're saying, well, a particular God exists, so therefore you would expect everyone to believe in a particular God, but they don't. They disagree. In fact, no one subset of humanity is more has more. You know, Christianity. There's more people who are not Christian than Christian. So right, that is self-defeating.
So I don't think it's self-defeating, but what I will say is that is some kind of evidence, but I would say it's weaker. So, for example,
it's exactly the same logic that
So look, the fact that people disagree on models of God, would come to disagree on models of God, may be less expected on theism, but it's not going to be as less expected as ubiquitous religiosity, I would argue. Because, I mean, after all, there isn't, I would say, anything that, I mean, we don't need to necessarily say that God forces people to believe. All we have to say is that God revealed himself, or has shown himself, or, you know.
Badly.
Well, I mean.
But badly. I mean, if most people don't believe in the correct God, like statistically, that is an absolute truth. No one can argue with that, because there's 7 billion people on Earth and not more than 3.5 billion people believe in any one religion.
Sure.
And then we can talk about denominations as well. So I really do think this argument defeats your original argument of ubiquitous religiosity, because there is ubiquitous religiosity, but ubiquitous incorrect or more prevalent incorrect religiosity, which is thoroughly problematic on the theistic.
So I'm not sure you're being charitable here, because the thing is, all religiosity is going to get some things right. And by the way, when I say uncharitable, I'm not accusing you. I'm not accusing you of anything. Like I'm saying that's how you come off. So like, so what I'm saying is, all religions will have something in common. Right? I mean, you can of course say that they believe in the wrong God, and that's fine. But you know, let's just say that they believe. They're closer to us than atheists are. So, for example, you know, ancient Egyptian polytheists are closer to us than atheists are, I would argue. So, my point really is that ubiquitous religiosity, of course, shows diversity in religion, but where it shows unity is what's going to be problematic for someone like you. It's not going to be problematic that there is diversity, which I agree, and maybe it is problematic for me. But what I'm saying is, where the unity is shown is going to be problematic for you, and the unity is being shown in a lot of places.
I'm not sure I understand you.
So you are citing religious diversity. So I'm going to say in diversity, there's going to be unity, right? There's going to be, you know, I guess in all religions, or, you know, in most religions that are ubiquitous among humanity, there's going to be similarities, such as the idea that God is some kind of fundamental reality. He explains stuff. He's supernatural. Maybe he's responsible for this. He upholds the cosmos. So, and what I'm saying is, wherever we find this unity is going to fly against your view, because
I mean, traditionally, most people were polytheistic, and in fact, monotheism came along late. So before monotheism developed, literally everyone was polytheistic. So you're cherry picking your time. So it's great to say this argument from now in 2022, but imagine living in 3000 BCE, and actually your argument fails because there is no unity. Because actually, or the unity there is fundamentally incorrect as per what you're saying. So the idea that you say, look, there's unity, it's easy to say that now because most people are monotheistic, although we can forget Hinduism and et cetera, and lots of other ones. So you'll cherry pick your parts of the religion.
Unity, I'm not talking about unity of gods. What I'm talking about, unity in ideas.
No, but that's part of the theistic idea. So in 5,000 years ago, you had many gods who were reflective of different human emotions and different human skills, and that because they were just
so all of them are tied together in something, right? All of them are tied together in the fact of human. So, for example, humanity's ultimate search for meaning, right? And that's going to be the question. Well, would we expect the only species to be preoccupied with such a thing, such an existential thing, if there were no God? So, like, I mean, I think you are trying to evaluate it. What I'm saying is, it is evidence for theism. I do think that it is evidence for theism. Now, you don't seem to share that sentiment, but I do think that in the world we live in, so if we lived in a theistic world, we would expect, we would actually highly expect that pretty much all species capable of being religious were religious, right?
Wait, I would concede that if in a world where theism was true,
sure.
Well, it depends what kind of theism you're talking about. If, in a world where theism is true and the God wanted to interact with humanity,
forget any desires God has. We don't have.
Well, no, because I think that makes a really big difference. Because if deism was true, right, then the philosopher's God, then actually all humans believing in a God wouldn't be.
But what we need to do is talk about
it does depend.
So what I'm talking about when I say theism, we're not talking about emotions or desires God has. We're talking about God that interacts with the world and cares.
Yeah,
so that's all. We don't need to posit that this God wants us to.
Yeah, but I needed to make that, because actually there are different conceptions of God where that it wouldn't be the case that you're saying. But I will concede that under theism, like an interacting personal sort of God, you would expect humans to believe in a God, right? Or at least it fits in well with that theory.
Yeah, so I do think that that's expected. What I'm saying is, evaluated with other evidence, I do think it's very strong.
But then it comes back to, like, if you have this personal God, especially where you're trying to tie up morality and things like that, you would expect everyone to believe in the same God.
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. So I think that diversity is expected on both of our views. So your view expects diversity, and my view expects diversity for the exact same reason, right? So we will have cultural differences, right? The way we understand Jesus is going to be colored by our difference. Just see how Jesus is depicted in Poland and compare that with how Jesus is depicted in Japan, right?
No, I'm talking about Islam, and I'm talking about Hinduism, Sikhism, and Buddhism. Like, there is fundamental religious diversity that you would not expect given a personal God. Like, you have to jump through hoops to justify, because not everyone has a true notion of what God is, which means people can't access God's proper love, especially if you're talking about faith being an active component in the success of judgment of life. Then I think it's super important. Like, the fact that most people on earth have got the wrong God is what you would expect if God didn't exist, rather than God did exist.
As I said, that's not the best way to characterize it. What I'm saying is that there is a hierarchy of how correct people are. So when we say they have a wrong God or right God, what I would say is the correction. So, for example, I would argue that we Catholics have, or Christians rather, have, or Orthodox Christians, as you want to say, have a highly correct conception of God, right? Now, I would argue that Muslims have a highly correct conception as well. It's just maybe 5 or 10% lower. And I would argue that Jews have...
Are you a universalist? I mean, would those Muslims go to heaven? So they would go to hell. So that 10% is pretty important.
Well, I'm not going to say who goes to hell, but let me say that people do go to hell. That's what I believe. Okay. So
we can come on to that, because I've got some issues with that. But yeah, carry on.
Okay, so like, I mean, we don't need to stay here. I mean, you can move on to my other points, right?
Yeah. No, but this is the importance of a discussion where we can like go where we want to, but also like linger on stuff to take it apart, because I'm unconvinced by your argument, but then I suppose you'd expect that.
You're unconvinced. Yeah, I do. But what I think is that you do think that this is evidence, which, I mean, again, comes cheap. But
I think I think it's actually neither or, because I think, given what I know about evolution and given what I know about our desire to understand things and patternicity and agenticity and all these things that we understand as being behind the reason that we are looking for attribution and looking for God's
argument for me, because I mean, that's simply explaining the origin. That's not explaining the why, I believe. So, for example, if there's a God, then there's good reason.
What do you mean? It is to explain the why. I mean, the agenticity and patternicity is useful for it's adaptive. It's evolutionarily adaptive. So if you're looking at a bush moving and you're thinking, right, that's a tiger, so I'm going to give that more agency than I think, and I'm going to run away because I think it's a tiger, then I survive, right? If I look at that bush moving, I think, oh, it's just the wind. Right, and it happens, and it does happen to be a tiger. Then the tiger eats me, and I die. So that kind of, we over determine that, phenomena around us, and we select for agenticity and patternicity and look for patterns because they are adaptive. And once you start doing that, you start building up pictures of the world which might be erroneous in terms of truth, but might have pragmatic value.
So I'd argue that that's actually just as good evidence of theism, because I mean, you would expect, if there was a God, for him to use evolution to develop religiosity, right? I mean, there isn't. In fact,
no. See, I would be, Paul Draper would not that I am Paul Draper, but he would disagree. In fact, a good number of people would say that evolution favors atheism as what you'd expect rather than theism. I mean, you can argue for theistic evolution. I just think you have to jump through more hoops, and as soon as you start jumping through more hoops, it becomes less probable.
Yeah. Okay. So, like, I mean, do you want to move on? I think we've reached an impasse on this point.
Well, I think evolution's it. I mean, goodness me, I'd be happy to talk evolution.
So I do think evolution is good evidence for theism, because I do think that evolution, after all, establishes that there is teleology, goal-directedness in nature. So I would argue evolution has good reason to think that God exists, in fact.
Yeah, but I would disagree with what that goal is. So goal is survival, because it's not actually a goal. I once wrote an article on this, which is like evolution needs to, for us to merely exist, evolution needs to be the mechanism. So if we didn't have these kind of survival, and you can't add agency to evolution. It's just this mechanism.
We're not.
Yeah, I know, but I had to get that right. But that just enables us to merely exist. So, I think, and then when you start looking at, and again, this is another Paul.
And that's goal-directedness. Your language you're using is, it enables us to. That's being directed towards enabling.
No, it's not. It's literally, you wouldn't exist if that didn't happen. So it just so happens that those mechanisms weren't so that we exist. Those mechanisms are in place and we exist. And in fact, our existence is necessitated by.
So the problem is you can distinguish function within evolution. So, for example, you can look at your heart and through evolutionary history determine the function. So, for example, you can see how weak hearts perhaps were eliminated through natural selection, right? So on and so forth. So my question is, would that kind of goal-directed process be possible? So be expected on atheism? And I argue, no, sorry, go ahead.
No, finish it. I was interrupting you. So finish.
What I'm saying is that kind of goal-directedness, I do think, is quite close to what Aristotle called final causes. Now, I know you have an issue with that, so I'm not going to go into the final causes thing, because that's going to be another rabbit hole. But what I'm saying is, just sticking easily with function and teleology, I do think that's not very much expected on atheistic worldview.
Well, I mean, there's something, and this is an argument I bring up in my book out next week, 30 Arguments Against God. So there's an argument concerning evolution for dysteleology. So teleology is this idea of meaning and purpose and design and so on and so forth. But actually, there are so many elements of human, and every animal has these, of design flaws that make no sense on the the theistic argument theory, but make a lot of sense on atheistic evolution, which is sort of blindly going forth.
So on a blind chance view, there could not be any flaws, because flaw by definition is a miss, right? So to miss something, you have to be hitting or intending to hit. So, for example, I don't think there could be flaws.
Depends how you define flaw, but something like the appendix or bad backs or you know, all sorts of problems with human anatomy are because evolution can only use pre-existing building blocks, and as soon as it can only use
flaw, right, on your view, that's just what happens.
But I don't need to explain. Here's the thing. I don't need to explain the fact that I've got MS, right? I don't need to explain the fact that people get bad backs, that someone's got, you know, quadriplegic because of X, Y, and Z, or that there's got appendicitis. I can explain that with evolution, and I don't need to explain that in the light of an all-loving, all-powerful, all-knowing God.
But what I'm saying is that on your view, those aren't flaws. But they are flaws, obviously, as you've noted, right? So for there to be a flaw, there has to be a proper way something is. And for there to be proper way something is, you must have some kind of
it's a desired way for what it is for our functioning. So this is getting very close to, and understandable for you because you're Catholic. So this is getting very close to essentialism, which is a kind of like there are these sort of natural forms that are the perfect way of being, and anything that falls short of that is a flaw. My version of flaw is the fact that if I was sitting here and designing a perfect human body, I would do a better job than that which I have, right? So therefore, there's a flaw in my body that doesn't allow me to be who I want to be, who I desire to be. But in terms of the broad scope of biological existence, it's not a flaw. Like the reasons that exists. It's actually, you know, it's what evolution is. That is a suboptimal evolution. Is suboptimal from a design point of view, but optimal from an efficiency point of view.
So I think that on that view, everything would be a flaw, because anyone would get rid of pretty much every human being would want to reform pretty much every part of the body. So there wouldn't be any proper function. There wouldn't be a proper way. If that was your definition of a flaw, there wouldn't be a proper way for the heart to function, because most people.
There isn't a proper way for the heart to function.
There is a way for heart.
No. It's just there's literally better ways for hearts to function and worse ways, depending on what your goal is. And if your goal is to survive, then literally to live, which is basically in order to exist, you need to be living.
So
right?
that rules out heart diseases that do not threaten life or well-being.
Yeah. To me, that's neutral.
That's going to be left out of medicine, because you can have a heart disease that doesn't threaten well-being. But
so what?
What do you mean? So what? The whole point is that the field presumes that you're wrong.
What do you mean? No, you can have if a heart disease causes you absolutely no consequential problem.
It's an anomaly.
It's neutral. It's neither here nor there. I mean, you can fix it if you want, but if trying to fix it causes you more problems.
It's not about fixing. The point is that you will get diagnosed with an anomaly. Right. So, for example, if I were to have a heart functioning right here, beating right here, right on the that's called dextrocardia, if I'm right. So, like on the right side, if I had a heart beating, right, that could be arranged so that it was completely healthy and I could live a long life.
Yeah,
that's an anomaly. That's not how it should be.
What do you mean? That's not. What do you mean? How it should be? This is you bringing in your idea of. This is the problem with your essentialism. So, and I have a real problem with that. There's no how it should be. It's just literally like, if I can exist in exactly the same way that I want to exist, then it doesn't matter where my heart is. My heart can be up my arse, as far as I'm concerned. As long as I can still function in exactly the same way that I want to, then. You know, whatever. And there are certain, so as Doc has just said here, there are certain, like, you can actually get hearts that aren't supposed to be how they are, but they are a certain way that can make you live longer. Well, that surely just means that every other heart is suboptimal and therefore is flawed. Every normal, perfect heart is actually flawed because it could be better.
Right. So the thing is, we're talking about how the consensus in the field functions. So the way the field functions is that we understand things. And we understand oughts. So from the fact, for example, that you have healthy eyes healthy, it follows that it ought to see, right? I understand that people will just, well, I mean, I don't know what's a healthy eye that does not see. I mean, I don't know how.
I disagree with your understanding of oughts. An ought is a goal orientated. So an ought for me
should then
is part of a conditional statement. So in philosophy, you have a protasis and an apodosis. So a protasis is a part of a conditional sentence that says, if I want this, and then you have the apodosis, then I want this, right? So if I want to see like this, then I have eyes like this. So an eye for me is like my life is adapted to how I use my eyes. So when you say, oh, a perfect eye, but it's already, my life is already like this. If I'm a mantis shrimp that has incredibly amazing eyes, it can see 16, you know, it's got all the different color spectrum, whatever, then their eyes are technically better. But if I was to have mantis eyes now, they would be worse for me because of the way that my life functions. So therefore, it all depends on your if statements. You set out your goals, and that's where you get your ought from.
If you do not like that kind of use of ought, you can say it's supposed to. It really doesn't matter what you use. So the point is, we can, of course, on paper write these things, but the way the field functions in medicine is that if you have a healthy eye, you're expected to see. If you don't see, you didn't have a healthy eye, right? That's a correct way to think about it. Same thing, right? If you have a healthy heart, it's supposed to beat. It doesn't matter whether you want it to beat. If the heart is functioning properly, then it is supposed to beat. It doesn't beat, therefore the heart isn't functioning properly, right? So if you have a health, we can use this example, right? So I mean, I don't know. So
I have a really real problem with like supposed to, because it smuggles in agency as far as I'm concerned. But look, a heart can beat. I've got a perfectly functioning heart, right? But it could be better, I'm sure.
Thank God.
But does that mean it's now presently flawed? I think Rob here, who's a fellow theist, by the way, but he's saying, would CC argue that 15 million years ago our brains were how they ought to have been? The fact that
15 million years ago there was no such thing as our.
Okay, well, is whatever original iteration of our early life form ancestors, you know, at any point during that time, the brain is adapted to its environment, and it will change over time. But at any one time, it's perfect.
That doesn't make a difference. What makes a difference is that from observation, we can know how some things function and how they don't, and from that we can infer if they're properly functioning, this is how they do behave, and if they're improperly functioning, this is how they don't behave. So, if we, for example, observe arrhythmia, of course, a lot of in the heart, right? Of course, a lot of the concern is going to be about making the person feel better, but also the other portion is going to be this isn't being healthy. So we can take, you know, organisms that really we don't care about. Like you can take a cockroach and you can assess a cockroach's organs, and it's not in our desires to keep the roach living, and roaches might not even have desires. In fact, they probably don't. So if you open a cockroach, you can still deduce, oh, okay, so this is an enlarged heart. It's supposed to be half the size of this, right? We can do these. And I'm saying, well, you know,
I still have a problem. Like if you open, all you can say is like most roaches have this size heart because they've evolved to have a body that fits a heart this big. But
that's teleology right there. What you said, they've evolved too.
So they've evolved so that they have a heart this big. No, it's not. It's not, because it's the environment. The environmental pressures of evolution will define how something evolves.
Teleological language. Again,
no, it's not like there's no agency there, there's no purpose. It's just like, here's an environment, and if a body is in this particular way, it's in order to either reproduce better or to evade predators better or to get food better, then it's more likely to, it's just a probability thing, it's more likely to survive, and therefore it's more likely to pass those genes on, and therefore the things that enable it to do those things are more likely to evolve.
You're already employing teleology, right? So if you're going to say that these are the things that regularly do happen for it to reproduce, that is goal directedness or causal regularity, right?
Yeah, so the goal is you're confusing just existing with a goal. Like I think that's
the word goal. You can use the word function if you don't like the word goal.
Well, no, it's just the idea that evolution has a goal. It doesn't have a goal. It's a necessary mechanism given natural laws that has to exist in order for a diversity as a species to continue to live.
Yeah. So for it to continue to, so what I'm saying is you don't have to believe that evolution has an end goal in mind, that it's supposed to evolve you. That's not what you need to,
No,
like, what you have to
no.
accept is this, that as evolution functions, you can detect causal regularity and function. So you can, for example, go back and see how the heart evolved. And with this, you can chart a logical process. And let's say, well, these were the deformities with the heart. So this many million years passed, and here are how the deformities got eliminated. And there's a process through which they get eliminated. My point is that this is a causal regularity. And saying that, well, this isn't a causal regularity, when everything describes this as a causal regularity, everything in a medical textbook or scientific textbook would have to talk about it this way.
You can have an organ that you get that gives you a disadvantage in a particular situation, and you would say, well, that's a flaw, right? And in other language, I'd say, yeah, that is a flaw. But in a non-teleological sense, I would say it's maybe suboptimal. But it just so happens that it makes it more optimal for that particular organism to exist in another context. In other words, it might be a flaw for this goal, but a benefit for this goal. And then it's like, well, do you know what? It's just you're messing around with like ideas of goals too much and thinking it's supposed to be like this. And this is part of the problem with essentialism, which is notwithstanding the issue of ontological issues with essentialism, which is where these don't exist. These ideas don't exist anywhere.
I didn't bring up essentialism.
But yeah,
related. I avoided bringing that up because that has a bunch of problems of its own. So my view is going to be very simple. I don't think you can avoid that language. I mean, I do think that you strive to, but I don't think you can. I mean, you do believe that there is proper ways, and I've said, like, from the fact that a heart is healthy, it follows that it shouldn't experience arrhythmia. It experiences arrhythmia, therefore the heart isn't healthy, right?
Yeah, but you're setting out the should within a hidden protasis. You are saying if you, like as Josh, you say, if I think a heart that operates like this, if I want a heart that operates like this, right? Because it allows. Well, but it's because it's about function.
We can say the same thing about cockroach charts. We can talk about the row charts. We have no desire for the roaches to live, and we can say the same thing about cockroach charts. We can evaluate cockroach charts and say, here's a cockroach chart. We cut this cockroach up, and we found this. This isn't how a healthy cockroach heart should behave. We can say that. And if you heard this in a film, if you heard this from a medical scientist, from a non-religious point of view, you would have no problem. You only have a problem when you hear it from a religious person.
You're hiding your teleology in words like healthy. So a healthy is just a way of being that is beneficial for a given scenario. So when I look at a particular heart, it's healthy if it allows that subject to survive longer than the norm, right? Than the mean average. Well, but even then, it depends. You can define healthy along any kind of spectrum. So what I'm saying is this completely depends. All of this talk and language depends on how you set out your conditional statements. If I want this organism to survive like this, then it needs to have these organs.
So what is the function of sexual desires in humans?
Okay, so what's the function of sexual desires?
Yeah, why do we have sexual desires?
We have sexual desires because they are beneficial for us to get to have sex, which is beneficial for us to reproduce, which is beneficial,
which is independent whether we want to have them or not, right? We didn't decide that these.
Yeah. So evolution happens outside of our desires, broadly speaking, over a long period.
So how is that not goal-directedness, right? I mean, you are able to pinpoint that this exists so that this would take place. You're able to say that I have these desires so that this would take place, so that this would be gained.
You're getting really close to like both a naturalistic fallacy and an is-ought fallacy. So you could say things like, well, we're natural, men are naturally inclined to have sex with as many women as possible, therefore sort of rape is fine, or ducks do it, and or alpha males have more concubines, and it's really problematic because I think that's a naturalistic fallacy. So
but you just said what the function of sexual desires were. I simply extrapolated
the evolutionary function. Yeah, that's why they have developed over time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So how is that kind of function? How does that make sense on a random chance worldview that you have?
through the evolutionary pressures.
It's not going to make sense.
They necessarily have to exist in order for the species to exist. Like if they didn't have, if humans had no sexual desires, right, we would die out and we wouldn't exist.
Okay.
So our mere existence is predicated upon us having sexual desires, irrespective of whether
Predicated.
Irrespective of whether we want humanity to exist in any particular way or whatever, you know, organisms evolve characteristics that are beneficial for them to survive and reproduce, and then after that, who cares, and you die. You know, and which is interesting because if you're talking about your ideas of flaws, then it's pretty flawed that actually after you've reproduced, your body just starts deteriorating till you die.
I don't actually, you're getting. Sorry, I shouldn't say that. You're getting the point, but I don't think you're getting the subtlety of the point. So flaws can only exist in a worldview where there are rights. So, for example, for there to be a flawed way something works, there has to be a right way it works.
Yeah, no, I get that.
You can't argue from flaws because
I was arguing from your point of view to
you were
show
just doing an internal critique.
that it didn't make sense. So you would have to argue that
okay, that's fair. So you were just doing an internal critique, but you have to bite the bullet and say that people, for example, dying of cancer isn't a flaw at all.
No, it's part of nature. Again, it depends how you define flaw. Like, it's a flaw to my desire. Like, I can imagine a more perfect way of designing humanity.
For example, it's not a flawed way. So atrial fibrillation is not a flawed way for the human heart to function. On your view, it is, because if I want the heart to function like this, right, then it needs to act like this. The desire, the roach heart. You don't care about a roach, and this roach experiences atrial fibrillation. Is it the normal way for the roach?
It really doesn't matter as long as the roach is able to reproduce and pass on its genes. It doesn't matter what its heart's like.
But
there would be neither flaw nor unflaw.
But there you go. But roaches can have no desire to survive, and you should have no desire to survive. And yes, we can still observe mechanisms in place to keep it surviving.
Yes, because that necessarily has to be in place. Otherwise, you would literally get non-existence.
One, that's teleology, but secondly, that's argument from adverse consequences. The fact that there would be bad consequences doesn't mean that that's the way.
No, that's not what it's saying. No. It's a mere fabric of existence. It's like, you know, in order to exist, there must be, you know, a certain thing. Like if we had deleterious mutations that took hold, we would just not exist. So in order for us to exist, we need to be able to survive, and therefore we need the characteristics that enable us to survive. It's just part of existence.
So I do want to move on, but I'm going to make one point, and you can respond if you want. So the point that I'm going to make is that I think you're very close to mine, but you just have to see that in a lot of these desires just don't factor in. Like I brought the example of, for example, roaches existing, but we can see that a lot in how the roach functions. For example, it's I guess compulsive drivenness towards wanting to reproduce with female roaches, right? Which probably they don't even have desires to. They don't even have, I guess, millions of senses that we do, right? We can, for example, safely say that roaches are driven towards reproduction because that's the way they've developed in order so their species doesn't die out. So it's independent of desire. Nobody needs to desire that roaches continue to exist. Nobody needs to want. So no cockroach is required, and our desire isn't required. We can actually want roaches to be extinct, but we can still recognize that the way they've evolved, they've developed mechanisms that ensure that their species will continue. And if that breaks, that's a flaw in the system. It's independent of desire. Sorry, go ahead.
My point earlier was all about, like, when we set out the goals, that is what we do kind of subjectively. And all these ought statements just depend entirely upon your protasis about what you're saying is like, if this. So, for example, if you were arguing from an evolutionary survival point of view, you might look at homosexuality and say, well, homosexuality is slightly less chance of reproducing and passing on genes if there's some kind of genetic inheritability to homosexuality or whatever. Thought experiment here. It doesn't really matter what the actual facts are. But I've got to the point where in my life where, like, I don't really care. As long as you're morally neutral to me, like, your body can function and your desires can function any way you like. There is no flaw to you. Because you are homosexual and I am heterosexual. I don't care that you are not flawed, because and I can still make the argument to say that evolutionarily you might be flawed or you might be suboptimal, right?
Yeah.
But so what I'm saying is there are different ought statements that apply to any given person or any given organism.
What I think ties all of them together is that they're inconsistent on your view.
No, my view is entirely consistent. I don't have any like holes or chinks in the armor of my view, as far as I'm aware. So I'm not aware of there being any inconsistencies. But.
Right.
And I would say, like, as far as evolution, just to take it one step further, so this is another argument to the Paul Draper espouses, which is that pain and pleasure is they are functional, evolutionarily functional, and you wouldn't expect a theistic. If theism was true, you would expect pain and pleasure to align pretty closely with morality, but actually, pain and pleasure don't align with morality, and there are some things that are pleasurable that are bad, morally bad, some things that are painful that's morally good, and we would expect this on evolution because actually they align with evolutionary pressures. So they're systematically correlated with evolutionary goals, survival and reproduction, not with punishing evil, spiritual growth, moral intellectual development, or human fulfillment.
So that is going to be evidence against my view, but I mean, taken alone, it's not going to be very good evidence.
Oh no, yeah, this is all cumulative. Yeah, I'd grant that.
So what I'm saying is, I do think, but yeah, I would want to move on because, like, I
yep.
want to see all the time.
Yeah, that's.
So now I'm going to address what I think is your flaw in your nativity account, I believe.
Wow. Okay, so completely different, right? So this is, hang on, because I like to plug stuff. This is, unless you're going to destroy it now, this is the Nativity, a critical examination, with a foreword by David Fitzgerald. Yep.
So you're like a party pooper. I mean, yeah. I'm joking, but like what I'm saying is, you just want to. Everyone on Christmas is getting. So this is actually how I saw it, right? I mean, I saw your video on Christmas. Yeah, so like everybody on Christmas wants to contemplate how Jesus' star was functioning, and you're telling anybody, "Oh, none of this is real," or something. So it's like, the ultimate Scrooge.
Yeah, basically. And I love it.
Yeah. So yeah, I do think there's a big flaw there, and I mean, I do think there's a bunch of flaws, but I'm going to I'm going to single out the biggest one that I see, and it's actually really good at illustrating how a lot of mythicist arguments fails. I'm not saying you're a mythicist. I know you're
which I'm not. Yeah.
So, well, minimalist sources, but yeah, historians.
Yeah,
so like, here's the thing. You state, you make the Alma argument, I believe, which I'm gonna steel man it. You tell me if I get it wrong. So you're saying there's good reason to think that Alma is the original reading of Parthenos in Hebrew, which referred to a young woman of bearing age, which might or might not have been a virgin, but it doesn't necessarily refer to a miraculous birth. And you're saying that, well, Matthew based his virgin account on a flawed text and made up, essentially, or there's an argument to be made that he made up a whole view based on a flawed translation.
No, he misinterpreted. But yeah. Depends what you're talking about, made up. But yeah. So he misinterpreted the or he read the translation, which is a mistranslation, and said, right. And his virgin birth was very different to Luke's virgin birth, and they're internally, contradictory.
Yeah. Also, what I understand is that you believe Luke and Matthew are dependent on each other.
No, I think that Luke actually probably used Matthew, so I go for the Farrier hypothesis. So
they are dependent on each other.
They are interdependent. Yeah.
That's what I said. Dependent.
Yeah. But sorry, when you said they are dependent on each other, that is to that.
Okay, so one depends on each other. On the other,
they're not like so. I think Luke was actually, and I'm more solidly believing this now than I did when I wrote the book, but it still doesn't change anything in the book. Where I think Matthew is definitely earlier than Luke, and I think Luke's nativity is an interpolation, a later interpolation. And I think there's really good reason to suggest
sure, that's fine. So let's stick with Matthew here. So here's my problem with this, right? I mean, so as I understand it, if this argumentation worked, your conclusion would be that Matthew made up a story based on a flawed translation, not that he already took something existing
He might, but yeah. So it's really difficult to say Matthew made it up. Matthew or his community that he's representing.
His community. Okay, that's fine. I'm just going to use Matthew on the basis. So where I find the problem with is the other point that you make, which is that there's good reason to think that there's pagan influences, such as prior virgin births. So my problem there is going to be
not massively. Like I won't die on that hill.
Yeah, I get that. I get that. But many people do make that argument. So what I'm saying is, I do think these two are exclusive of each other. So I do think that if the Alma argument worked, then the pagan influence hypothesis becomes completely superfluous. And I would argue that that pretty much makes fun of all the research that has been done in that field, right? It would just make all of that research about Romulus and others just laughable. And I would argue the other way around, which is that if, for example, the key inspiration was the pagan myths on Matthew, then it would make the Alma argument mostly superfluous. Not completely, but mostly superfluous. So I do think you have a tension there, because you cite both of those as evidence against the nativity, at least in your video.
So my opinion of what Matthew did is that he wants to create a Jesus that competes, that trumps Moses, because he's creating a new Moses. So he writes Jesus as a new Moses coming out of Egypt. So he has to have Herod being the new Pharaoh and all this kind of stuff that he sorts out. But he's really good at trawling through the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, to find verses that can support the stories he's making up, or that his community has made up, or that have developed and become more and more legendarily embellished. So as he's doing this, he's looking for stuff to support or to confirm his claims, all the while looking around and saying, right, we've got Caesar Augustus, who is Divi Filius. We need Jesus to be better than that, because Jesus is competing with Caesar Augustus. So he needs to be Divi Filius. He needs to be the Son of God. He needs to also have a virgin birth, and all the a miraculous birth and all these sort of things. So it's like, okay, and now I can find that from the Old Testament, from the Septuagint. So he gets the Septuagint, said, right, brilliant, this supports what I'm trying to say. Excellent. I've got a little snippet, and he does this a lot, which he takes out of context, because actually, if you look at the rest of the verses that comes from, does not apply to Jesus at all. Right. So he takes up the very, King Ahaz and honey and curds and all this sort of stuff doesn't apply to Jesus. But I'll have that little sort of virgin birth bit, because that tags on to this. So no, I would disagree with the tension.
So that's not an argument you made on myth vision, because I would recommend everybody to delve into myth vision. And there was another person in the statement.
Yeah, Aaron Adair, who wrote this book, The Star of Bethlehem, A Skeptical View.
So yeah, that's funny. You just have everything handy. So I got like a bunch of Britannicas, so I'm just better.
yeah, this is true. I can't compete.
Yeah. So my point is, my point is that that's not the statement that you make on myth vision with the other guy. So
I'm pretty sure it would be
So I might be mistaken, but I'm going to give the way I remember the events, and then people can rewatch and see if I'm wrong. So I'm already preparing that I could be wrong. So as I see on myth vision, you make a pretty strong case that there's a good reason to think that if the Alma argument succeeds, then this could give us reason to think that Matthew made up the story based on the verse, not that he had a prior reason to and just used this as a supporting verse, right? So I do think if we go to the myth vision part, that's what you imply. Now, again, I listened to it a couple of times. I might be sure. Go ahead.
Well, yeah, whether I don't know whether I spoke. I mean, the idea as it is how I explained it. I mean, whether I said something else, I don't know, but that's how I explained it, which is he trawls through the Old Testament, he finds things, he misattributes the virgin birth thing to that, and it's wrong. And the idea is that it's supposed to be a prophecy, but the problem is it's mistranslation, which means it can't be a prophecy, and it should have been young women. But he's saying it's prophetic, and it's prophetic, and look, Jesus is this wonderful, miraculous birth, and that was a mistranslation. So he can't use that to defend this, and then you can pick apart the birth and all these other reasons.
Yeah, so I mean, as long as the point is clarified that that's not what you meant, right? I mean, you didn't mean that. Okay, sure.
Yeah, I mean, it still holds. Like Alma's, Parthenos is a mistranslation of Alma. There's plenty of good scholarly reason to think that, to conclude that. And Matthew is trawling the Old Testament for quotes that he can attribute to Jesus' narrative, and he creates a narrative to fit these Old Testament quotes, or he's taking the quotes to fit the narrative. I mean, either or. We can't get inside the mind of Matthew. All we can see is like the narrative, which looks bunkum, the quotes, which are quote mined and problematic, and then the internal contradictions with Luke, and it all becomes a hot mess.
Yeah, so I would disagree with all of those, to be honest.
Naturally.
So I'm a big nativity guy. I have to say that, unfortunately. I mean, I know
Yeah.
a bunch of people who are going to say, whatever. But
Well, you're going to love this because this is a Catholic. So, I mean, I presume you've read The Birth of the Messiah by Raymond E. Brown, who is...
I've read parts of it, yeah.
Right. So that is one of the best books ever written on the nativity of Jesus. He's a Catholic exegete, so he should be up your alley. Although, he riled a few people because he's not hyper-literalist. And in fact, he would say that the nativity carries a theological verisimilitude, but it's a historical dramatization. And as soon as you start, to me, that's a huge problem, because if you're saying that these authors did dramatize the events, which means they aren't history, how can you hang the theology on that?
So first of all, I mean, I understand that people do have that interpretation. I'm happy with that. I interpret a lot of things that way, but not the nativity. I do think the nativity is a bulk of it is historical. Let me say that. So I'm not opposed to there being things
I just
that
don't know how Luke and Matthew can be reconciled. They just can't be.
I mean, I wasn't attempting that, right? I mean,
but that's the nativity for me. I mean, the problem with the nativity is either Matthew.
So let me try something. Like, the thing is, we have to get minimal facts, I guess. Minimal facts of what it would mean for the nativity to have occurred. Like, what would it reasonably mean? So one thing is, well, Jesus would have to be born, and that's something you agree with, right? I mean, that's the minimal fact. And I mean, Jesus was born, and presumably, if we want to be more fair, it would have to be virgin birth, and some of the traditional chronology has to be correct. So we don't have to go maximal fact. We don't have to, there is no additional strain of reconciling Luke and Matthew in order for it to be true. Now, some people have undertaken that. That's not my intention here. All I'm saying is, let's take the minimal facts of what it would mean for the nativity to have occurred, right? What would it mean? So would it mean should have happened on December 25th? I'm just joking. I'm just joking there. But, what I'm saying is, you should have Jesus being born, which you agree. It should be miraculous.
That's your minimal facts.
But that's one. The second is, it would have to be.
No, but that's it. That's the only one.
No, that's not. So Jesus should have been born. He should have been born of a virgin, and some of the chronology should be correct, right?
Well, sorry, you're saying should have been born. Are these facts, or are these what you want to be true?
So what I'm saying is, if these are true, then the nativity occurred.
Right. Okay.
So what I'm saying is, you have a certain chronology. So look, what I'm saying is that you're placing an undue burden on the defender of the nativity. So a defender of the nativity doesn't even have to be committed to an inerrancy of the Bible, right? They don't have to be committed to any of that. What they have to be committed to is that this is what happened, and what happened is Jesus was born, right? That's one. His birth was miraculous, virgin birth, and some of the chronology is correct. So, for example, if the wise men showed up, but let's say it turned out that the shepherds were made up, let's just say it that way, right? The nativity occurred. The nativity account has happened, right? Now, in order to understand why I disagree with some of your points, we have to go to 2 points. So one is your comparison with Moses, and that's something I've explored actually a lot in the past, and it's undeniable to me that the nativity account has a lot in common with the nativity account of Moses, as described by Josephus. And for those people that don't know, I mean, the nativity account in Josephus is very close. However, I don't think that there's a valid inference from saying, therefore, it didn't occur or likely didn't occur. I mean, we know from history that comparative biographies are very, very common. I mean, you can go to Plutarch comparing Greeks and Romans and trying to draw parallels, right?
You've got to look at what Matthew does all the way through. So he has Jesus coming out of Israel, out of Egypt. Out of Egypt, I will call my son Israel. You've got Herod becoming the new Pharaoh, killing the firstborn, or murdering the firstborn by killing the slaughter of the innocents. You've got Jesus talking on the Mount. And delivering sort of moral proclamations, which is Moses up Mount Sinai and the Ten Commandments. You got, Dale C. Allison. Go and look at his book on how Jesus is mapping Moses.
No, I agree with that. I agree.
Yeah.
So what I'm saying is, like if you take the view that Luke and Matthew are mostly independent, which I think has good reasons for it. Like, you're not going to like this, but so let's say that take Luke's account of what we have with the Sermon on the Mount, right? So take that account, for example. And what we have is there is no Sermon on the Mount. These are sayings of Jesus. And Matthew puts it in the context of being said from a mountain in these, let's say, particular points to resemble Moses. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. That's making a theological point along with history, just like was common with other historical points. But more to the point, again, I don't think you're addressing the non sequitur objection, because what I think is what you have to have is, if we're putting this in an argument, what you would have to have this fact, this fact, this fact, therefore the nativity didn't happen. And I'm saying that inference doesn't follow from the facts that's presented. So nobody who supports, let me finish, I'll be done in a second, right? So nobody who supports the nativity needs to be committed to the inerrancy of the scripture, right? Nobody needs to be. I'm not saying I'm not, which coincidentally I am committed to the infallibility, not inerrancy. But this is a topic that's separate. Okay, nobody who defends the nativity account needs to be committed to inerrancy. So they do not need to reconcile Luke and Matthew in order for nativity to have occurred. This is not something that follows. Now, secondly, the imitations found in Gospels, there is no correct inference from them to say, therefore likely this didn't occur, right? Because similar inference could be followed, therefore likely many of
when it's breaking natural laws, I'd say we got a pretty good reason to say it didn't occur. Like, I'm not saying a priori it didn't occur. I'm saying that if you're telling me, so you said, there are these facts that are being presented as if they're facts, and we agree that they're facts. They're not facts, right? Okay, so you've got a supernatural star. You've got Herod killing a bunch of children. You've got Jesus being born of a virgin. You've got angels appearing to shepherds, and seeing like God incarnate, and wise men seeing God incarnate, and all this stuff happening, and then going to Egypt and coming out and angels appearing and dreams and whatever. These require it's Bayesian. I would fully say this is Bayesian reasoning. These require a stupendous amount of evidence to support me believing these being true. These are claims that are out of the ordinary. Are Matthew and Luke extraordinary evidence? No, they're not. I don't believe them. They don't reach the level of evidence required for me to believe the claims.
So if you're going to look at it from that point of view, then I would agree with that. But what I'm saying is, I'm not going to go through that right now, but I'm going to say that if we were to have preliminaries, right, I do think you could make a good case for it, right? Thank you to Dustin and LRB. Thank you very much.
CC is much better than Lydia. That's because I debated with Lydia McGrew on the nativity, but she was.
But this isn't a debate. This is a conversation. This is
yeah. But thank you so much, Dustin. It's really, really kind. Thank you. Any super chats as well? Please get them in and ask away. But yeah, carry on. Sorry.
Yeah. So the point that I have made is so the point that I'm making here is that the miracle issue is separate, but here's like the little bit I'm going to say. Like, if the main part precluding you from believing in the nativity is just a miracle part, right? Well, what I'm going to argue is
it's not actually. It's not just, and I'll explain why it's not just that. But yeah, carry on.
Sure. So so what I would argue there is, well, if there is good reason to think that God exists, which you don't agree with, but I would say there is good case to be made for that, then what I would say is we would expect some miracles to occur, right? Some miracles would definitely occur. So my point is, well, okay, my gosh, you have a book for every situation.
Why I am atheist and not atheist, and 30 arguments against the existence of God. So yeah, I don't believe God exists. Sorry, no, carry on. I'm being facetious.
I know. So what I'm saying is, isn't there like a planting a book where like there's a plethora of arguments somewhere for God? Oh, I got like books here for 5
hours. But they don't work.
I'm just joking. I'm not going to be displaying that. But so what I was saying is, I do think ultimately that if you have preliminaries, if you have these preliminaries that come up, right, you are going to be able to make the case for the miracles. So yeah, I donated that super chat.
Thank you so much. That's really, really kind of you, by the way. Thanks, Joe.
Just $5. So, but like, what I'm saying is, well, miracles are going to have to be laid aside for a little bit. We can talk about them, but that's I'm more interested, I guess, presently to hear your I guess, textual problems.
Yeah.
And so what I'm going to say is, forgetting the miracle part, like, just treat miracles, let's say for the sake of this conversation, as, improbable, slightly improbable facts. Like, Alexander conquering the world, right? That's a hard fact to believe. That's close to a miracle, I would argue. Maybe you won't agree. But if you were to like evaluate the claim of, Plutarch, right? Well, Alexander is compared, I forget, with some Roman general. I can't remember who. But so Plutarch compares Alexander to a Roman general. Right? And I would argue, well, there's comparisons. Plutarch tries very hard to draw out. Plutarch definitely makes up speeches for Alexander, right? Plutarch has made blunders historically. Plutarch wrote an entire book about a person that we now know probably never existed, Romulus, right? So, all of these are going to be factored, and none of them are going to give us the inference of, therefore, Alexander didn't actually do this. So
But
I'm going to see the same thing. Like, you are going to gather all the evidence, and I don't think how it's going to be different from the Plutarch case. Now, again, laying aside the miracle part, like, treating miracles like they would be, slightly more pro. Sorry, go ahead.
yeah, so well, the miracle part is the main part, which is like we don't believe the miracle claims in any other text in the history of the world. Like literally, the history of the world. You and I don't believe the miracle claims in any other history, but in any other like cultural book or whatever. So it's the exceptionalism of the Bible. Okay, well, is the evidential burden of Matthew and Luke in this case, does that reach the desired outcome of convincing me to believe? No, these are unknown texts written in unknown places with ex post facto agenda.
I disagree.
No historical.
I would argue I disagree with that. I'm going to disappear. So we don't know who wrote them. Is a fine argument.
We can guess. Okay,
but that's not a correct argument. So we do know who wrote them in a sense, right? So we do know, for example, that they were written by educated Christians. We do know, for example, if you are, let's say, a mainstream scholar, that they had foundational sources. We do know, for example, that a lot of what they preached was preached by.
We don't know they had foundational sources necessarily. I mean, this is where it gets into a lot of textual. Yeah.
Okay, I mean that's going to be mainstream consensus. Maybe you don't agree. That's fine. What I'm going to say is I don't think it's fair to say we don't know who wrote them. We don't know their names.
But I know. But we don't know who their sources were. Like literally, we don't know who their sources are. Some Christians like to think they know, but they don't. So anyway, the point of all this being that if we saw the claims that we see in the Bible written in Plutarch, we wouldn't believe them in Plutarch. We just wouldn't believe them. So because Plutarch doesn't present good enough evidence to support the belief. In the same way, we don't believe the miracle claims and Suetonius and other probably Plutarch as well have fanciful miraculous claims in their history books, and we don't believe them. Suetonius
my approach was a little bit different, right? So my approach wasn't to prove them to you. My approach was to say that none of the arguments to say therefore they didn't happen works. That was my approach. So, for example, I'm saying that none of the facts that are purely gospel related are going to be saying that therefore they don't work. Now, of course, you can appeal to this kind of philosophical argument against the miracles, which is going to be strong. I agree, but that's a discussion for a philosophical time, right? What I'm saying is, if we were to, let's say, just pretend for a second that the miracle part is just like an extraordinary claim, not necessarily a miracle, because we don't want to get too philosophical here. I'm going to say that none of the simply objections you have against the Gospels is going to be enough to say to get to the inference, therefore it didn't occur.
No, you put that all together and you say, right, here, are they writing with agenda? You look at the historical method, right? And you look at all the arguments for the historical method and which talk about, distance from writing from the event, more likely to be biased, noting their sources, all these things. And you're like, right, they are hugely problematic. And then not just for the miracle claims, you look at, and this is what Lydia McGrew failed. In fact, she kind of conceded this point, which is that Luke says that they return straight away after the birth via the temple Jerusalem in order to circumcise Jesus and then straight back to Nazareth. So they return that to where they already lived. Right? Matthew has them chased out of the country as political refugees, chased out of the country by a murderous king that doesn't even appear in Luke, right? But the open contradiction, which is, I think, all terribly contradictory, and has them already living in Bethlehem and then never having gone to Nazareth. Matthew has them coming out of Egypt about 2.5 years later, but we can check that from the safety of Herod dying and then his son taking over, so on and so forth, and then going to Nazareth because it is now safe, right? There is no way you can read Luke and get a 2.5 year sojourn in Egypt from Luke's text, which says when this was finished. So when the ritual sort of stuff had finished after 8 days, I think it was, of the nativity. So after 8 days of being born, went to the temple. As soon as it finished in the temple, went back to Nazareth, right? Matthew, they go to Egypt for 2.5 years.
So my point, Jonathan, if I may call you Jonathan,
yeah. Call me what you like.
Familiar. So what my point is to you is that you are putting an undue burden on the defender of the nativity. So no one who defends the nativity has to reconcile Luke or be committed to biblical inerrancy. They don't have to hold to these things.
But if you do, that's a problem.
Well, yes, it is. So, like, I mean, I do think that they have to be reconciled. And so, for example, I have a higher view than many others do. So, for example, I, of course, do believe in mainstream scholarly consensus. I'm not like a guy who ignores all of it, but I'm going to be more like, Gary Habermas type of guy than Bart Ehrman. Let's just put it that way. All I'm saying is that I don't have to. I can be. I would. Sorry?
It's convenient. No, carry on.
No, it's not convenient. So, for example, I don't need to argue all that. What I'm saying is, it's actually wise to not have to. You don't have to argue all of these things, right? So, for example, if somebody says, show me what reason I have to believe that Jesus resurrected, I don't have to argue that all of the Gospels are reliable. All I have to argue is that they present as good evidence that Jesus resurrected, right? So what I'm saying here is that you're giving me undue burden. So, like, do I believe that the flight to Egypt is historical? I do believe that flight to Egypt is historical, and I do believe that Matthew picked that story specifically to coincide with Moses. I believe both of these. But do I have to defend that in order to establish that nativity happened? Sorry, not establish that nativity happened, but argue that there isn't anything in your book that undermines the nativity happening. And I'm going to say no, none of that, because all I have to, I guess, argue is that minimal facts. What does it mean? Jesus was born. His birth was miraculous. Some of the chronology, at least, is correct, right?
So it looks very much like you're cherry picking the chronology to I'll drop that bit because it's not super important. But
no. So you're doing the same about this. No. So, for example, if you believe the historical Jesus existed, as you said, you're a historicist, and presumably you believe that there is, let's say, some parts of his chronology that match. You're doing just exactly the same. This is what historians do. This is what we do with Plutarch all the time.
I have no reason to think that two accounts that are not historical accounts, these are agenda, these are evangelizers trying to convince the audience they are talking to or presenting to believe in their cult leader or in their sect or in their religious organization, whatever. This is absolutely not history. I have absolutely no problem with discounting the nativity accounts and, in fact, the Gospels at large of both. I just want to say thank you. Sorry, I'll let you reply in a second. Thank you, Doc, for if the nativity was a miracle, why would Jesus' family try to take custody of him because they thought he had lost his mind? The idea that the shepherds actually they saw the most wonderful thing and they're never heard from again. The Magi saw the most wonderful thing and they're never heard from again. And in fact, the nativity just sinks in terms of like knowledge of it ever happening until like 60 years later when the gospel writers write about it, because it's not in Mark and it's not in Paul. So we have to wait until Matthew's writing in what, 85 CE.
So I argue that if the case.
Thanks, Doc.
Oh yeah. Did you receive? I think I sent another.
I'm just gonna pull that up again. You're too kind. Thank you. Canadian Catholic, best supporter. Thanks, Josh.
No worries. No. So, like the point that I do want to say is that if the case can be made that Luke and Matthew are independent, which I do think they can be made, then we can make the case for resurrection traditions that predate both of them. So I do think that a very good case can be made. In fact, this is the consensus among scholarship. I'm not saying because it's the consensus it's correct. I'm just saying that it is the consensus that Matthew and Luke are independent. At least their nativity accounts are independent, as in they don't contradict it.
I mean, I think Gnostic Informant, I see you're going to be talking with him at some point. He said, I'm warming.
We have a debate scheduled, but it's not about the nativity. It's about whether Christianity is logical.
Well,
I am ready to move on, I guess. I mean, I do think we've reached an impasse. So, like,
well, actually, one of my friends here, who's a Christian Universalist, he wants to know just what does CC think of universalism? Sorry to bang my favorite drum. He likes a bit of universalism.
I mean, everybody wants universalism to be true. I'm not a universalist personally. I'm more of like a Orthodox Christian. But that being said, like I'm not opposed to universalism. So I'm more open to. So I'm not a universalist, but I'm open to universalists. I don't think that they're the worst. And there have been church fathers who were universalists, like some people say Gregory of Nyssa was, and so on. So
I think if I was a Christian, I'd 100% have to be universalist, and here's for why. And I'd like you
I
to
know
answer
you
this.
hate hell. I know.
Well, yeah, it's just that I don't understand. So so here's the thing: do you believe God has divine foreknowledge?
Yeah, I do.
Okay, so given divine foreknowledge, and this is the whole problem. Incidentally, do you believe in a literal Adam and Eve?
So I do believe they existed. I don't believe that evolution is defied because of it.
Okay, I might have to park that because it's all a bit that's a whole.
Let me make this clear. I do believe that there were first humans whom God ensouled. I don't have to believe that.
Okay, right, yeah.
But I do believe there were literal two people who were.
But well, actually, so that doesn't change anything from what I'm going to say. So the idea of this,
I do believe that the original sin happened. That's what you.
Yeah. Which is kind of like, so it doesn't really make much difference. So that's cool. So the idea of divine foreknowledge is that God created humanity, right, and knew in advance that Adam and Eve would choose incorrectly and punish humanity as a result of Adam and Eve choosing incorrectly. But if God knew that Adam and Eve were going to choose incorrectly and is punishing us all on behalf of that choice, then that's fair if Adam and Eve represent us. In other words, if we put Josh in that position, you would make that wrong decision, and everyone would make that wrong decision. Okay, so that's fair enough, right? But it means that it's a flawed design. So if God's designed us and we're always going to fall, and he knows in advance we're going to fall, and then he punishes us for falling, and that yet he's the one that designed us that way and knew that we would 100% do that, then that isn't very fair. But hang on, the second horn of the dilemma is if it's non-representative, which means Josh wouldn't make that mistake and would choose well, then we are being punished as a result of a non-representative decision made by other people, which is also completely unfair. Just the two horns of that dilemma are insoluble, in my opinion.
So my view, you'll have to repeat that in a bit, but let me just try to address what I heard. So the first point that we have to make is a couple of things. So first of all, we don't believe that people go to hell because of original sin. This is an important point that we have to make.
Yeah.
We do believe that people go to hell because of personal sin. And I mean, the historical point was that people who have original sin, this was the historical belief, at least in some circles, go to a non-fiery place where they don't suffer. They're not like in heaven, but they're not in hell either. They're very good, basically. But forget that for a second. What I'm saying is, well, why do people suffer? So original sin is not the same thing as personal sin. So people don't go to hell because of original sin. That's the important part. Now, secondly, original sin is more akin, on our view, to a defect. It's passed down biologically, right? So it is literally passed down through human sex.
Sure.
So, for example, it's not that you have a flaw in the sense of something you've done. It's something that's been taken away from you. As if think about how genetic mutations get introduced, right? So when for example, let's say you have a genetic mutation where you lack a finger and your parents pass that down to you. That's sort of what we mean by original sin. So original sin is.
But God knew that would happen and designed us that way anyway.
So God knew that would happen, but it's important to differentiate your view of God's foreknowledge from ours. So we don't believe that God's foreknowledge is as we foresee it. So, for example, God isn't rewinding it. God's knowledge and our actions are interdependent. And that's actually important because God knows, for example, that Adam sins if and only if Adam sins. Okay? So God's knowing does not necessitate Adam sinning.
This it sounds very similar to middle knowledge, maybe. Or
no. We deny. No, we're not.
Yeah. But that. So if God is ultimately responsible for the design of Adam, right? And knows that Adam will, or Eve, or however you want, Adam and Eve will make that decision in that circumstance, right? This is going to happen 100%. And this, God knows this causally before creating.
No, we would disagree with that. So there is no causally before. So God's knowledge is atemporal, we would argue. So, for example, God doesn't know before it happens. God just knows. That's our point. This is actually another point, but this is the point that Boethius makes. I actually had a whole entire class on this in University of Toronto.
But God knows before it happens, though, and doesn't change it from happening anyway, and is ultimately responsible for designing Adam and Eve. Or for having control over the design of Adam and Eve.
Sure. So God knows that Adam and Eve will sin, right?
Yeah.
And God knows that
we will be punished on behalf of, or we will suffer, or there will be original sin on behalf
sure,
of them.
none of that necessitates Adam and Eve sinning, on our view.
But he's created the contingent universe and knows 100%, and Adam and Eve will do that.
Sure.
How is God not responsible for that? So the analogy is this, right?
So, give me a second. I'm going to turn on the light because it's getting too dark here.
Yep. Let there be light.
Yeah, sorry, it was getting a little bit too dark here. The sun goes down really quickly. So, but what were you saying? Like, this is like you seem to have the same objection, like traditional. How is free will reconcilable with?
It's similar to that, but I actually don't need to get down that route. It's like if God knows that Adam and Eve are going to do something, and He's ultimately responsible for designing them. And designs them in such a way that they do that, then God is ultimately.
No, so we did not. So God did not design. Yeah, so that's I guess where we would disagree. God did not design Adam and Eve so they would sin. None of that would have to follow. So, sure, go ahead.
Well, he designed them surely knowing what they would do, or was it just blind design?
No, he knew. So okay, so I think that what you said there was kind of unfair because you said. He designed them to do this thing, right, or something like that.
He designed them in such a way that they would do that, and knew that they would do that. No, he must have to. So he's got the modeling clay or the design sheets or however you want to imagine it. So he's designing them. He says, right, if I do this, they are going to choose incorrectly in the Garden of Eden at this point. Right?
So that's it
is blind design. So he designs them not knowing what they're going to do.
No, I don't think so. Okay, look, we don't believe that God's knowledge necessitates them doing anything, right? So God knowing that Adam and Eve would sin does not mean that they have to do it.
But he designed them. He designed everything about them and the causal situation in which they're sitting in, and this is the grounding objection, and it has so-called. And so he knows that in this situation they will do X, right? In CC1 they will do X. He knows that, and he's designed CC1 and he's designed those agents. So there is nothing about this.
They don't have to do X. So like this is the same problem. From the fact that God knows that they do X, it doesn't follow that He necessarily knows.
Yeah, but it means they only have one option. So they only have one outcome. There is only one outcome.
So think about it this way. God, Adam choosing to sin is a contingent fact. So Adam choosing to sin is a contingent knowledge that has always existed in God. That doesn't make it necessary knowledge. So it doesn't follow that God knows necessarily that Adam will sin. All it follows is God knows that contingent fact all the time.
So this is the grounding objection. This literally is. So I look up the grounding objection. So this is to say that in order for him to know that in that situation they will do that and not that, there has to be, and to know that they would not do that in a slightly different situation, there has to be something about that situation that grounds their decision to do X. And that is either in them or is in the causal situation itself, or a combination of both. There's something that grounds that situation, because if there isn't something that grounds it, then what their choice is random. Like there is only caused and uncaused, right? And this is linked to determinism.
No, that's the objection towards libertarian free will. That's not an objection.
But it's relevant for this as well, because if you know 100% that they are going to do X in CC1, and you have designed CC1, and you've designed the agent, and you've designed all the mechanisms that are involved in them making decisions, and you know that they're going to make that decision, how is God not morally culpable?
But I'm going to ask Ben, how does it follow from the fact that God knows that Adam and Eve will sin, that either God necessarily knows this, or it's necessary that they sin? How does it follow?
Because he has infallible foreknowledge that it cannot be any other way. So it cannot be. There can be no scenario in which
all you're saying is that it's necessary because it's necessary.
No, it's if you mate, none of this is necessary. Like none of this happened, but.
You're doing an internal critique. You're not.
No, yeah, I'm doing so. Yeah, so if you believe in a God with divine foreknowledge, full omniscience, and his foreknowledge is infallible, and interestingly, this also this also invalidates his own free will, because he knows he cannot choose differently to his own predictions of himself. So God can only do whatever he has predicted himself to do by having divine foreknowledge of his own future actions. He cannot ever do anything outside of his own predictions. So he is like a automaton, just fulfilling his divine duties, or divine. He's like a railroad trolley going down a railroad track.
No, yeah, that's a railroad. So God has no duties. But again, the question that's going to be here is that it's a contingent. Let's put it this way, right? I think just a second. Wait a second. Okay, just a second. Somebody opened the door. I need to close it again.
Yeah, no worries. I'll just say that not sure at all. God is not off the hook. Divine foreknowledge is, I'm pretty sure,
so you have
problematic.
Let's say you have a contingent action, right? So you have a contingent action on one hand. You have a contingent action of Adam, and then you have knowledge of this action and infallible knowledge of this action. So how does it follow from this that this infallible knowledge is necessary, or that this contingent fact is necessary? How does it follow? How do you get that?
Actually, I don't particularly believe in necessary anyway, so I think that's problematic. But
you're doing an internal critique.
Yeah. But I've actually argued that if you believe God is necessary, and we are God is a perfect creator, and we are the creation of God, then we are arguably necessary. We're like a necessary extension of God. So therefore, if God has to be optimally loving, has full foreknowledge and full power, then that which he creates, and he knows it's going to be, we are just, there is no kind of like, I'm just going to create this world because it might be good, it might be bad. It's like, this is the best possible world he can create, either right now or in a journey towards that. And so therefore
my view is there is no such thing as best possible world. It could always be better, I guess. So there's no way.
So God can just create rubbish. He's like a painter that's like, just paint some suboptimal stuff.
So God can create anything that doesn't contradict his nature.
Well, but that would contradict his nature, because it would be sub loving. So it'd be suboptimal love. It would not be omnibenevolent. So that would be contradictory.
Yeah. So, like, for example, creating humans just for the sake of suffering would contradict his nature. Yes.
Well, yeah, I would argue. So my argument was going to be, if you believe in hell and he knows in advance every single soul or entity that will go to hell, and creates them anyway in the full knowledge that they will go to hell, then God is creating them so that they go to hell. He doesn't need to create them.
But like, from the fact that God knows doesn't follow that he's the one that is causing you to go to hell, right? I mean,
if he's creating me, I didn't have a choice in my creation.
Fine, in the ultimate sense. But what my point is that
that's the only sense. Like, that's entirely right. In the ultimate sense, yes.
That's just occasionalism. We deny occasionalism. There's primary causation. There's secondary causation. So but that's entirely the point.
He is ultimately responsible, which is why I used that term earlier. He is ultimately responsible for creating us, for designing us, and for our outcomes, given that he knows our outcomes and creates us anyway.
Yeah. So what I'm saying is there is bunch of different kinds of causes, right? There's a distinction. You can find this in Thomas Aristotle. You can find this.
I don't agree.
So that's just occasional.
I don't believe in the Aristotelian cause. I think they're different words. They're different meanings.
Okay, so that's fine. I mean,
but yeah.
I mean, I've talked to Ahmed, and he also doesn't like causes, but that's fine. I mean, that's too much of a rubbish.
Yeah, actually, and he's quite knowledgeable on causation as well.
Yeah, so like, I'm not going to try to convince people of causes here. But all I'm going to say is that from the fact that God, for example, designed you, it doesn't follow that you don't commit sins, right? That's all I'm saying. So, like, if you're going to hell for your personal sins, it doesn't mean that God is committing your sins on your behalf.
But if God designed me and knew that I would commit those sins,
so how does it follow
from anyway?
So how does it follow from that it's not you making your sins?
So here's my analogy that I wanted to hit you with. So you are a CEO of a car company, right? No, you're a lab scientist. So do the lab scientist one first. So you're a lab scientist, and in your lab, you create sentient beings, right? In your lab, and you know 100% that once you create them, Josh, they will leave your lab and they will go out into town and they will murder and rape. About 80% of them murder and rape, 20% will be nice, right? And you think, right, I know they're going to do this. I know 100% infallibly that they're going to do this, but I'm going to create them anyway. I create them knowing that they will do this, and I create them in such a way that they do this, right? So then they go out and do that. the police would have every right to knock on your door and say, you are morally, ultimately moral, even though they when it did that with their own free will. I don't believe that exists, but if they went to do that with their own free will, and you knew that they would do that, and you created them in such a way, like you ultimately, they wouldn't have done that if you hadn't created them, and you knew they were going to do them. Ultimately, you are responsible for what they did.
Sure, but that's disanalogous to what happens with God.
How?
Okay, so one, it's disanalogous because God didn't design us that we would do those things, and secondly, as I said,
too generous. Thank you.
No, I mean it's just peanuts. But the point is, so my point is that's the first part, and secondly, I don't see how God's knowing something in advance makes him responsible for it. That's what I don't see, I guess.
No, but it's the knowing. It's not just the knowing. Like if I knew 100% in advance, right, that you were going to make a cup of coffee at 10 o'clock tonight, right? That, I agree, doesn't make you make that coffee, right? I agree. And I wouldn't be responsible just by knowing you were going to do that for you making that coffee. However, if you didn't exist and I created you knowing that you would make that cup of coffee, and I created you in such a way that you would make that cup of coffee. In other words, I gave you hands, and I gave you like taste buds and all. You know, I knew that I created all the tools with which you would come to do that thing, right? And that thing wouldn't have happened if I hadn't created you. Then I am ultimately responsible for you drinking that coffee at 10 p.m. Ultimately responsible.
So, I mean, if by ultimate responsibility you mean cause, then, I mean, we don't deny that. I mean, we do believe that God is the cause of everything, pretty much. So, you know,
including evil.
In that sense, yeah. I mean,
yeah.
So evil doesn't exist, but God is the cause of those actions that do produce, I guess, what you would call evil. But all that matters is cause in what sense, right? So, for example, God doesn't do evil, right? God is upholding those conditions in which evil happens, but the reason
God designed plate tectonics, right? That caused 240,000 people to die in 2004.
Sure,
like
but
we didn't cause that. We didn't design that. God did.
So imagine this is God and this is plate tectonics. This is the cause that God is, and these are intermediary causes, right? So all you're saying is if this exists, then these don't, and I'm saying that's not the case.
No, God could create that causes that causes that causes that. But if he knows that will cause that will cause that will cause that will cause that,
it doesn't follow that has to be necessary. All it matters is that it's contingent. It doesn't follow that it is necessary because of it, right? So, for example, from the fact that God contingently knows that Adam will sin, it doesn't follow that Adam has to sin, right? So the same thing could be said.
Okay, forget Adam. I mean, I 100% disagree with what you're saying. Sure. Talk about plate tectonics. So he knows he designed the laws of physics to work in the way that they do, and he designed plate tectonics to work in they do, and he knew 100% that the tsunami in 2004 would kill 240,000 people, and he created that way, and he could have stopped it in the same way he could have stopped Adam doing it. He could have stopped Adam eating the fruit. He could have stopped it, but chose not to.
So that's just a problem of evil then.
Well, yeah. There's pretty much all problems are part of the problem of evil.
So
but when you have divine foreknowledge,
then the answer
is a huge problem.
Yeah, but then the answer is simple, right? Some evil is just necessary for further good to happen. That's it. Like, I mean, that's simple answer.
God creates an entire contingent universe that didn't need to exist, but God created it anyway. Yeah, and God created it. This is what you'd say, and God created it anyway. And it's like, I didn't need to create these people, but I will anyway. And I didn't. These people I know will go to hell, but I'm going to create them anyway. And I'm going to create plate tectonics. It doesn't need to happen, but it will anyway. And I could stop it, but I don't. And this all could be for, and the Christian has to say, this could all be for a greater good. And it's the logical problem of evil, which is there might be a reason it could, all of this, including you stubbing your toe this morning, there can be no gratuitous evil, from cancer down to you stubbing your toe. And yeah,
there is gratuitous.
But then what's it again? It's an abduction. What the inference to the best explanation? Does this look more likely on atheism or theism?
So yeah, I agree that the problem of evil is evidence against God. I mean,
I think it's huge, but also design. I think you can fix it.
But I also think that problem of good is evidence against atheism. So, like, we're just stuck. I mean, I would argue, right?
I just think, the whole kind of designing, God designing humanity in such a way, as in a particular way. That's what I mean by in such a way. He designs it in a particular way. Like, we could have had 9 arms. We could have had a mind that was slightly different. We could have been slightly nicer or whatever. He's designed us in a particular way that a certain amount of us do wrong, right? And go to hell. But he didn't need to produce us. He didn't need to. So God is producing people to go to hell, right? And
no, that's wrong.
Is, to me, morally abhorrent.
He designs people, and he, I guess, wishes, if you would like, that they go to heaven. Right? People choose to personally sin, and they go to hell, and God knows this. Now, I don't see how it follows from any of these that God made people so they could go to hell, unless we're just going back in circles, right? So I'm saying, from all the data, your conclusion doesn't follow. So just going back isn't going to help. What's going to help is presenting. Okay. Sure. So, like, you present a bunch of premises, I guess, or a bunch of steps. So one step is God created this, that, and I'm saying, okay, and people sin, and for that personal sin, they pay the price, which is hell, right? And God knew this, and how does it follow from this that God wanted this to happen or designed so that it would happen?
I mean, of course God wanted it to happen. If it didn't happen, like, God can do whatever he wants, right? So this is the whole problem with Satan and hell, right? It's Satan doing stuff, right? If God is truly omnipotent, God could make Satan disappear at the click of the fingers, right? But he doesn't. So therefore, whatever Satan does is done on the behest of God. Anything that doesn't happen, like a tsunami not being stopped, right? If it doesn't happen, or humans committing evil, happens because God wants it to happen, because God could stop it. So therefore, God wants it to happen for whatever reason he wants it to happen. This is skeptical theism, the logical problem of evil. But you have to say that God wanted that to happen. And not only that, but you had to say there could, if he wanted it to happen, you'd normally say he wants it to happen for greater good. You also have to add on another argument, which is to say there could be no better way to achieve that greater good than that happening. So, for example, 240,000 people dying in a tsunami has to be the optimal way for God to achieve whatever goal he wanted to achieve by those 240,000 people.
Well,
not one less, not one human being less, and not one animal less. So, because if it could be achieved, he would have done that.
So one is we don't believe that the universe is deterministic. That's, I guess, what's our difference. We do believe in foreknowledge, not in determinism. But that being said, I
don't think that matters, actually. But
sure, let me make this point though. So God doesn't have to, for example. So God doesn't need to make sure that you kill me so there is some further greater good, right? It's enough for God to make the case so that it's possible for you to kill me, for there to be greater good. And let's talk about, like, free will defense. I know you don't believe in free will, but let's think about this for a second, right? I mean, assuming that free will is a good thing, right? Assuming that morally significant free will is a good thing, then you can't have it and no possibility of significant evil. So the story goes, right? So God doesn't need to make sure you kill me. All God needs to make sure, I guess, is that there is conditions where if you were that evil, you kill me, right? And there's a bunch of theodicies here that could go.
Why couldn't he do me on the intentions, right? Why create at all? Why have you dying? Well, he knows in advance that I'm going to do that. Don't create me and send me straight to hell.
Those are just
why
questions.
Do you have to die as an instrument for my free will? So that's instrumentalism. That is like utilitarianism. You're being used as an instrument for a greater good. I mean, all theodicies are consequentialist in nature, and I think they're thoroughly problematic for God, unless you adhere to moral consequentialism, in which case they're fine.
So I adhere to virtue ethics, I guess, which, I mean, they have some intersection together, but
yeah.
So Doc, did he have a question?
Floromanaut says, if Satan has no power except that given by God, can't we conclude evil came from God himself and is necessary for his ultimate purposes?
Well, in a sense, I've explained this, right? In a sense, but what I'm saying is, in the sense that everything is upheld by God. So hell is upheld by God, right? So sorry?
I was just saying, thank you, Doc.
Yes, thanks so much, guys. So, so as I said, if you have chain of causes, right? So you have ultimate cause here is God, and you have the effect right here. That doesn't discount these things over here, right?
But if he knows each step,
and what follows from that doesn't make those steps necessary. All that means is he knows they will occur.
but they are necessary in by point. Okay, let's take the agency of Satan out of this, but let's go back to the tsunami, right? Because that's stuff that no human, there's no mind that has any control over any of those variables, right?
Sure.
That is, God is ultimately responsible for the laws of nature and for creating plate tectonics.
So all God needs to do, so God doesn't, so all we need to do is God allowing there to be conditions where this could happen for a greater good.
But he allowed it, so therefore he wanted it. So that's horrible.
But what I'm saying is that there is a greater good that could be achieved. So like,
this is the point. But you have to say that I agree. Like, but this is why it's an abduction to the influence of best assimilation. Because although you can say that, I think it's really weak. As you know, this is
evidence against theism. I agree.
But I would say that
as the problem with the good is evidence against atheism. Sure.
I'll get you to explain that in a second. So the idea that you know there could be a greater good that comes about, but it's also, as I said again, I'm repeating myself, that you would also have to add on that in order to achieve that greater good, this is the optimal way of doing it. So literally 240,000 people had to die. Millions of animals had to die in order for that greater good to exist, which we don't know about. So there's a lack of clarity. There's a divine hiddenness. We don't know what's going on there. We don't know why God did that. It's not communicated at all. But you are saying there must be a greater good, and that not a single life, less life could die, because otherwise one fewer life would have been lost. Because, you know, God, therefore, you can't have gratuitous death and gratuitous suffering. So that's the optimal amount of death and suffering that had to exist for the greater good.
No, I don't have to accept any of it. All I have to accept is that let's take this theodicy on which that if there were, for example, like no natural evils at all, let's just think, or any kind of evil, we could not have certain things we value, like, for example, courage, perseverance, you know, valor, triumph. And my favorite example is, like, you know, you couldn't have sports if there was no possibility of losing. So God doesn't have to ensure that exactly this team loses, right? Even though God knows. What all that God needs to make conditions for is there's a possibility for that team to lose, and sometime it might occur or will occur. So, I mean, the point is that you could argue that tsunamis are necessary for some further good. And again, I can't explain it. Like,
you could, you have to. I don't say you could. If you believe in omnigod, you have to argue that. There is otherwise God is not omnibenevolent. I mean, it's a problem of evil. So you have to argue that.
I do argue that.
But you also have to say that 240,000 people is the optimal amount of death. Because if it's not the optimal amount of death, if God could have achieved the greater good that you claim could come about as a result of 240,000 people dying, if it could have been achieved with 210,000 people, then why has God allowed that 30,000 people extra deaths that's actually now gratuitous?
What you mean here? So what you mean here is none of it has to be gratuitous, and I agree there. So
yeah. So you not only there are two problems for you. Not only do you have to,
I don't have to argue that that's exactly how it should have happened, right? I mean, there's other ways it could have happened. All I'm saying is none of it was gratuitous. That's all I have to argue.
Yeah, but what? Yeah, exactly. So 240,000 people is the optimal amount of suffering, and all the animals is the optimal amount of suffering. There can be no less suffering to have achieved whatever greater good you claim there must be. Because if there was any less suffering that could achieve that greater good, God would have had that less suffering because he's all loving. Therefore, like whatever good, and bear in mind, we don't know what this greater good is. You have to argue that 240,000 people is necessary to achieve that greater good.
So I don't have to argue that it's necessary. All I have to argue is, so, I mean, you could argue, for example, that, you know, those 240,000 could have died with other circumstances. So I don't have to argue all of that. All I have to argue is that there was nothing gratuitous that happened there. That's all. Right?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what I'm saying.
Right. So, you know, that's all. So I could argue, for example, that, you know, 210 of those were unnecessary, but 210 of those were like horrible pedophiles whose death was good, right? I mean, you could imagine that also as an answer. All I'm saying is, what I have to argue is that none of it was gratuitous. That's all.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think you're diverting maybe with a few points there, but like, yes. But I don't think you quite understand the magnitude of what I'm saying. Is like God has to. It's the same with this world, the world as a whole. God has created this world, there can be no gratuitous suffering. So every single unit of pain that's ever existed in this world is necessary to achieve a greater good. There is no unit of pain that can be unnecessary, that can be gratuitous. Whether it's stubbing your toe in the morning, you stubbing your toe is necessary to achieve a greater good. Because if it wasn't, then God would have it some other way that didn't have as much
Okay,
pain.
so you're again not quite. So sorry again. I don't think so. God doesn't have to make sure that you stub your toe today. What God has to say is that there should be conditions where you might be able to stub your toe today. That's all we have to argue for. We don't have to argue that God does. So,
but you do, because God could stop it happening, and this is what I think you're not quite understanding. Like if He was all loving,
occasionalism. So what's occasionalism for those listening is that God is the only causal agent. God is the only thing that causes things. So we disagree with that. What we're going to say is that the cause of you stubbing your toe is going to be you, right?
Yeah,
There's no other causes.
But God can override that.
Sure.
So God. So the point is that even on your kind of understanding of like other like agents involved, and they could happen in other ways and blah blah blah. Like, but it did happen, and God could stop it. So God didn't stop it. So therefore, it was necessary or it is serving the purpose of attaining a greater good. But because God cannot allow gratuitous pain, there can be no less amount of that suffering to have happened. Otherwise, it would be that way. Well, God doesn't override any of these instances. The 240,000 people dying, He didn't stop any one of those people dying. They all served the purpose.
Yeah. So the gratuitous doesn't need to be understood that way. So the way gratuitous can be understood is, we could say, for example, that there's good reason that people should be able to stub their toes. That's all that we have to claim. We don't have to claim that that God should ensure that there's minimal amount of people.
Okay. So in order to say that, you would then say, right, they should be able to stub their toe for whatever greater good, right? And let's say there's 200,000 instances of people stubbing their toe, and what the calculation is that people should be able to stub their toe. Maybe let's say that is the greater good. I don't know what the greater good is, but he said people should be able to stub their toe for whatever reason, or just for the reason in itself. And in order for that good to allow to happen, I'm going to allow people to stub their toe. I could allow 900,000 instances of stubbing toes, or 1 instance of stubbing toes, but I'm allowing 200,000 instances of stubbing toes. And my calculation has to be.
That's the wrong way to look at it, right? So here's one way to look at it. God gives you the free will to act as you wish and make, for example, hard gestures with which you stub your toes. And 2, He creates possibilities for you to stub your toe, right? That's all that we need to argue. We don't need to argue that God, for example, is actively causing 15 stubbings of toes. What we have to argue.
But He's omisively causing it because He's not stopping them.
I mean, if you call not stopping causing.
Well, yeah, but especially you've created the whole universe, so you're ultimately causing everything. But especially if you know it's going to happen. But if you're like, so if this is, but in law, this is pretty like, if you're just about to fall off, like if I'm standing next to you, right, and I know that you're going to get I don't know, something bad is going to happen to you. You're going to fall off a cliff or something. And I don't stop you, but I could stop you. Like, I have some kind of responsibility in allowing that to happen. Now, if I'm then also God and created everything anyway, it's even more amplified than that. I've chosen a bad example, but this is omissive will.
But that's not the same as our view, because our view is that God has further good would be prevented from being achieved had those conditions not existed. So, for example, if you've allowed those conditions under which I would fall, that's different from causing me to fall, right? So the point is that God has allowed those conditions under which you fall for a greater good, right? So, for example, if you, for example, have to allow a person to fall because this prevents, let's say, if you're a consequentialist, let's say 200 million deaths, then, I mean, no law is going to charge you for that.
But that's my point, is that, yeah, okay, if you're going to allow that to happen, or that needs to happen for a greater good to come about, then you can have no less suffering to happen for that greater good to come about. Or no more suffering, because then that would be gratuitous. That's the whole point. The whole point is that it's an optimal amount of suffering to achieve that greater good.
No. So the optimal amount doesn't necessarily have to be suffering. all that there has to be is maybe the possibility of suffering. And
but it has to be if God has the power to stop that extra pain from happening. Why doesn't God stop it?
He doesn't have to. There's no have to. What
He is if he's all loving. So if you see someone that's just about to get run over by a bus, right, and you could pull them out the way, you would pull them out the way.
As I've said, the possibilities of being run by a bus are necessary for a further good. That's the possibility that God opens. Some people will be run by a bus, some won't, based on their, let's say, free will.
But that's exactly my point. That has to be an optimal amount, because if there's like 50 people who are going to be, because it does, because God is all loving. So every decision that he makes is in light of being all loving. So every decision is also a decision not to do something. So it's a decision not to.
That's again occasionalism. There is other agents that operate in the world. There's other decisions that are being made.
But any agents can be overridden by God, and God has overridden agents in the Bible.
Overriding agency is bad. Okay, is so not.
But he does it in the Bible.
So, like, I mean, I'm saying normatively.
Well, so is overriding agencies bad? So if you see someone just about to punch and mug an old granny in the street,
I'm just saying, I was just doing an internal thing.
It's bad to overcome. Like, I would step in and say, especially if there's a much smaller person than me, like beating up a granny and mugging her, and there was no danger to me, I had absolutely no consequences to me for doing this, I would stop that person from beating up the granny, because that is a good and moral thing to do. But God doesn't. So, and God doesn't an awful lot. And so therefore you have to argue he doesn't do that because actually a greater good comes about from that. But I am saying that
greater good comes about from the possibility of being able to do that. He
does step in at some point, but doesn't in other points into history, in time and space, because he's all loving. And in order to be all loving, there must be some perfect amount of stepping in and not stepping in. Otherwise, you have to resort to Stephen Mateson's argument from the ordinary morality presupposes atheism. So Stephen Mateson says that so imagine, so that old granny, that kid with the old granny. Now, we know that when we take a kid to get injected at the doctors for polio or whatever, give them a vaccine, we know that there's a little bit of pain that will bring about a greater good, which is resistance. So what we don't do is when the doctor's just about to inject that little boy in the arm, we don't go and rugby tackle the doctor and beat him to the floor and say, don't you give pain to that kid, because you know a greater good's going to come from it. Now, any kid beating up an old granny, because God cannot allow gratuitous evil, right? This is why Stephen Mateson's argument leads to moral paralysis. So he says that basically you should not stop that kid beating up the granny in the same way you shouldn't stop a doctor injecting a child, because a greater good has to come. There can be no gratuitous evil. So if that boy beats up that granny, a greater good has to come about from it, because God is omnibenevolent. So we should stop from being involved in any moral action because it disallows a greater good to come about.
Yeah, no, I completely disagree with that, because that completely misses human agency.
Well, you can take it up with Stephen Mason. I mean, it's a really good paper. I can give you the syllogism. It's a very, very interesting argument.
So I do think we've been on this topic for quite a little bit. I mean,
yeah, we probably need to draw things to a close fairly soon.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
I was just going to say, if anyone wants to get any more questions in or anything, please do, and then we'll wrap this up in a short while. Thank you for all sticking around. Thank you for an active comment section and live chat. It's really, really good of you. What were you going to ask, CC?
So let's talk about your stance about Catholicism, though, because I do think you are quite critical of Catholicism. Now, I have to say, I am very nonchalant, so I don't get offended if my religion is insulted at all. So
I don't think I am. I think I have a problem with the hierarchical structure and the cover up of sexual abuse and all that kind of stuff. As far as other than that, it's just like any other religion with a penchant for ritualism, I think. So I'm not really. I mean, I worked in Catholic education institutions for a decade. I had this room. I had this rumor that you especially are opposed to the Roman Catholicism. That's not true. I was what, especially
opposed to the Roman Catholic faith.
Not particularly, no. I mean, I'm opposed to faith schooling in Britain, and I think Catholic schools. I came a cropper. I can't legally actually say something, that I want to say. And that's the truth. That's the truth of it. But I'd love to say it because it's a great example of cancel culture. I was effectively cancelled by the Catholic Church, but I won't go into it because I legally can't. But but in all honesty, like, I don't really have an axe to grind with the Catholic Church. Outside of, I have a particular axe to grind with sexual predation that has been covered up systematically, including, as we now know, by the previous Pope. I mean, we knew it before, but it was like rubber stamped recently. So I do have a problem with that. But I would have that same problem if it was any other organization in the world. It's more difficult when it's an organization that professes to be particularly moral.
All right. I mean, I see. I guess that's cleared up. Yeah.
But yeah. So there you go. Is there any final sort of nuggets of conversation or points or arguments you want to make?
Yeah. Well, why don't you tell us a little bit about the Exodus book you're writing?
So yeah. Well, this to go back to.
Is that like fair and balanced, or is it just like nothing occurred?
So what happened is I wrote the Nativity book, and because it was an intersection, it was the point in the New Testament that intersected the most with known history. So it's the most verifiable set of claims in the New Testament, actually, arguably in the Bible. There was like Luke made some particular claims, Matthew made some particular claims. Do they marry with each other? Do they marry with known history? So I wrote that book doing a whole bunch of research. And then in the subsequent years, I did a load of articles on the resurrection and thought I'm going to turn those articles into a book. And then along came the resurrection, a critical examination of the Easter story, which was bookending Jesus' life. And the point was saying that because in the resurrection as well, you have intersection with known history, which is to say that if Jesus, at the beginning of his life and at the end of his life, we can verify those claims. And if those claims fall down, historically speaking, then what does it say about the whole ministry of Jesus and all the claims in between? Well, actually, what epistemic right do we have to believe these if we can't believe the ones that should be verifiable? And then I thought, okay, because having done a load of articles on the Exodus independently, I thought, right, let's put this together with a colleague of mine, with a friend of mine who's an archaeologist, where if Jesus has come to fulfill every jot and tittle of the law, and if Christianity is built on the foundations of Judaism and Judaism is built on the foundations of the Exodus story, let's look at the Exodus story to see if that cuts the mustard as far as being historically verifiable is concerned and archaeologically verifiable and makes sense theologically. And so I've been looking at that, and it doesn't do any of those things. And in fact, there's next to nothing that supports the Exodus account. And then the question is, if you don't have the Nativity, you don't have the resurrection, you don't have the Exodus, what are you left with? That's the whole story of what I'm trying to do.
So, like, are you critical of Islam as well, or other religions?
I have been. So, funnily enough, in my previous blog, the previous blog I had, and I have taken this talk to different universities as well, which is I wrote a piece on Islam being violent. So I read the Quran.
Well, that's not what I mean. Not the violent, but like the historicity of them.
Well, not the historicity, but the theology of it. So about the violence of it, and I'm really critical of Islam, and I got harangued by quite a lot of fellow liberals, and it's quite interesting because for me, I was like, I've been doing this for Christianity for 10 years. You've not batted an eyelid, right? Now I attack Islam. I'm being attacked by fellow liberals, and that was a really interesting experience because it's like, is this because they are seen as an oppressed minority? Because actually, I'm doing exactly the same here as I would have done to Christianity, and you supported that wholeheartedly. Yeah. So there's a really interesting dynamic that went on there.
Yeah, it's weird. It's pretty weird.
But I just don't have the time to look into the historicity of Islam. But I would ordinarily, I don't have a problem with that. There you go.
So yeah, I mean, I do like what you're doing. I mean, it's interesting. I just disagree not on like.
I just disagree with everything.
No, I mean, I disagree with the conclusions, but not like, I mean, you're exploring an interesting field, like, free will, nativity. I told you I'm a big nativity guy. I'm a big Christmas guy.
Well, when next Christmas comes along, let's put it in the diary because we can have a good old debate about it.
So you don't like celebrate Christmas?
Yeah.
Oh, you do?
Oh yeah, of course I do. Yeah, it's just a lovely celebration. Yeah, it's a cultural kind of. And in fact, it co-opted itself. I've written a couple of articles on this. So Christmas has co-opted a bunch of different like elements from Saturnalia, from pagan ideas, from Egyptian ideas even. And so there's nothing that's sacred to Christianity, particularly that's in that, other than the Christ bit. But all the stuff around it, you know, Christmas trees, evergreen wreaths, candles, all this stuff that Christians think are owned by Christianity, or actually Christianity nicked from pre-existing sources.
That actually I completely disagree. That's what I call the pagan Christmas myth. So a good resource on this would be actually a fellow atheist, by the way, Tim O'Neill. So you guys can look up pagan.
Yeah, I know him, and I would disagree. I mean, I've written some posts on this, and I know some of the claims aren't as strong as some atheists think they are, but they're also not.
So, for example, I mean, you know, like new atheists have all this idea that, you know, Pope ordered celebration of Christmas to try to overtake, you know, the pagan stuff, and there's like no evidence for it. But yeah,
no, I've not made that claim, but yeah.
So like what I like, you know, just balance it out, right? I mean, you don't need to. But yeah, I mean, I enjoyed this conversation, and it was nice, and I mean. I gave a couple of super chats, like not too much.
But yeah, that's very, very kind of you. Thank you, Cici. It's really kind.
Yeah, and I do think it worked out, and I think the stream was also a success. I mean, it was like active throughout. I don't know, like, do you get that many this activity on live streams? Maybe you do, but
yeah. So this is it depends. It depends what video it is, but these have been active, and I think when you have someone on who you disagree with, you're always going to get people coming along and being into that. So you know, but we'll do this again if you want. You know, I'm up for it. You know, if you want me around to yours, that's fine, or whatever, however you want to play.
Yeah,
but I'm happy to have you. Yeah, keep in touch. But thank you so much. Where can people find you? I've shown Canadian Catholic as your.
Yeah, my blog is also nice. I do blog, and you know, it's in my description that you can go to about at the Canadian Catholic thing. I go by my real name on Facebook and Twitter, but that's not really necessary. Most is like personal stuff. Now, Jonathan knows my stuff, but like I don't try to hide it, but it's unnecessary. If like so we got a bunch of big stuff coming up. I got some big names coming, in addition to the names we've already had. So you don't want to miss those. Like, you know, again, Noam Chomsky, you know, Bart Ehrman, Richard Carrier, Richard Swinburne, Saul Kripke, you know, Lawrence Krauss. Like the list goes on and on. Simon Blackburn, Jonathan was very pleased with that, and Ari Fahman. So we got a really good cohort there, and that's nice. Yeah, I think
good stuff.
I do have. I think I have a resurrection debate or discussion coming up with Camille Gregor. I believe you're familiar with him.
Yeah. No, I don't know. No, I don't. Oh, I'll have to look into that. Thank you, Dustin, who's always a great sport and a really good support of the channel. I've enjoyed the back and forth. It was enjoyable, guys. Thank you both. Well, thank you. Thank you for listening. So thank you, guys. Please, just the closing would be check this out. It will be out in the next week or so.
And Barker wrote a forward to that, right?
Sorry?
Dan Barker wrote a forward to that.
Yeah, so Dan Barker's written a forward to that. It's I love this book. It's a nice, easy read, but it's packed full of actually a few of the arguments that we talked about tonight. So to
Is it illustrated?
Like, the divine.
Are any of your books illustrated?
No.
Why don't you illustrate your books?
Well, I let the words do the talking.
I always prefer illustrated books. I always say this. I prefer illustrated books over non-illustrated. Always. Yeah. But I definitely would recommend some of your books. I do think your book on free will is a good example of what's wrong. Actually, I'm sorry, I have to say this, of what's wrong with the argument, because I do think there's a good case to be made for free will. Now, I'm not going to be buying into like extreme, like libertarian free will type things that people have, but I do think that free will needs to. I believe in Dr. Richard Carrier criticized you on his blog for
yeah, but again, that's just merely about compatibilism against hard determinism. So realistically, and we had a back and forth, and I disagree with Carrier on it, but what we both do is deny libertarian free will. So it's like it's all semantics. It's a bit like Greg Caruso and Daniel Dennett's recent book, Just Desserts, which is like both from two people, one a compatibilist, one a hard determinist, who both deny libertarian free will. Fair enough. That's like me and Richard Carrier. But we would deny the kind of free will that Christians generally believe in.
No.
Mm-hmm.
So compatible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So compatibilism denies libertarian free will. So compatibilism denies the ability to choose otherwise, the principle of alternate possibilities. So it's saying that you are going to choose whatever you're going to choose within any given situation.
Just to say, I also deny the principle of alternate possibility.
Well, that would sound rather like you deny free will and the garden of forking paths. So that would say that you are going to choose whatever you're going to choose in any given moment. But what the compatibilist says is, or the classic compatibilist would say, that is what you wanted to do. What the hard determinists would say is, but what you wanted to do was itself determined. So this is Arthur Schopenhauer. You said that a man can do what he wills, but he can't will what he wants.
Yeah.
So to me, it's like, well, if you define free will as doing what you want, fair enough, we've got free will. But if you say that if what you want to do is itself determined, and that denies free will, then that
I would definitely recommend Dr. Richard Carrier's critique of you. Unfortunately, I mean,
I've read it and responded to it. Yeah.
There's a couple of things. One is actually why syllogisms usually suck. I believe that's the name. But you can look up others. But yeah, that was actually a good critique of Jonathan's syllogism against free will. So I do thought that was very nice. So I would recommend that particular blog. But
I would definitely recommend my response to it.
I actually haven't seen your response to that, to be honest.
Yeah, so it's on Patheos. I wrote several responses. In fact, I still haven't finished. I ran out of steam because they take so long. And he wrote.
So your Patheos is done. It's like closed. You're not going to be on it.
I can't submit new articles to that. I just do them at Only Sky. But all the ones on Patheos are still there. And they've also been transferred across to Only Sky, so they're in two.
So they told you can't blog anymore. Why? What did you do?
Because the Atheist channel, they got a new CEO who's a fundamentalist Christian and didn't want people to slag off religion and people to be too political. And we're like, A, we critique religion, and B, we're pretty political. So they're like, you're gonna have to leave. Sorry. I was like, okay, so that's the end of interfaith discussion then, which is what it was started for. So then we went off and started Only Sky. Well, actually, that was a separate thing, but a lot of us came on board with Only Sky, but we were basically cancelled. And you hear this idea that the left is always cancelling. It's like, well, pretty much every I've been cancelled several times personally.
Oh, yeah, many other directors cancelled. But yeah, thank you to Mr. I don't know. Do you have a doctorate? I know you have a master's.
No, just a mister. Just a mister.
You have a master's, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I've got a master's, PGCE, BS, BA, and yeah, so on and so forth. Fun and games.
So
but yeah, no, thank.
You're like a frequent drinker.
Yeah, no, it's late here, and I've had a long day, so
not because of that, like your name, Tippling. I think that.
Yeah, so this all started when the Tippling Philosophers is a group that we used to go and meet down the pub once a month and formally discuss philosophical ideas. And then, so I was being one of them. You
guys were like an atheist group?
No, actually, it was started by a conservative Christian who was on this thread earlier. He's become a universalist. We started it together, and he's kind of like, most people have moved a fair amount in their beliefs over the 15 years that we've been doing it. But yeah, it's just a nice way. People love doing it. That's why people come to YouTube and listen to these kind of conversations. People love to be stimulated, and there's nothing better than going down the pub with 5 of your friends, 6, 7, and just talking philosophy and religion, and people having different views and disagreeing with respect. It's great, and hopefully we've done that tonight.
Yeah, it was wonderful. Though I just drank water, though.
That's no worries. Hey, I wouldn't want it any other way. I wouldn't enforce my desires on anyone else. Look, mate, really appreciate that. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you to all the people who have joined in. I hope you've enjoyed this. Do check out all my other stuff. Please like, subscribe. Please subscribe. And I'm going to do a thanks for getting me to 1,500 subscribers. I know it's only a small goal milestone, but it's brilliant. Thank you so much. So I'm going to do a live stream at some point soon. Do all the likes, subscribe, and all that, and check out Canadian Catholic. And remember, question everything, especially yourselves. Thank you, Josh. It's been a great chat. Take care, and I'll speak soon.